The ceiling above him was made of wood, coated in dark varnish, and golden cranes, painted by someone's patient hand, soared across it. He blinked. The cranes didn't disappear. Somewhere behind the thin wall, a man's voice was monotonously reading something in a language he shouldn't have understood, but for some reason he understood every word. He raised his hand. The hand wasn't his. Thinner. Paler. With an ink stain on the thumb and a bracelet mark on the wrist. His heart thudded. He began to count. 72 beats per minute, normal. His lungs were working, his fingers bent, his vision was clear. An old woman in a hanbok was kneeling beside the bed, crying as she packed her belongings into a worn wooden chest. She didn't see that he had opened his eyes. A voice from behind the wall uttered the word, Chorsan, and the woman shuddered from head to toe. Her hands froze above the chest. Nam Do-yoon didn't know what Chorsan meant, but judging by the way the old woman's hands were trembling, he realized he had just been exiled somewhere. He sat up in bed slowly and carefully so as not to startle her. His body felt light and weak. His muscles had almost no strength left. Someone had not eaten or moved in this body for a long time before him. The woman raised her head and saw his eyes. Her expression changed. She was used to seeing emptiness in those eyes, but now there was something else there. He looked at her and asked hoarsely the first thing that came to the engineer's mind. He asked if there was coal where they were going. The old woman stopped crying. She looked at him as if, for the first time in her life, she were seeing this boy alive. Her name was Park Seon-yo. She had served in this house for 30 years. She had raised the fifth prince, Lee Do-hyun, from the day his mother died in childbirth. She knew his every habit, how he never raised his eyes in the presence of his elders, how he would flinch when someone raised their voice, how he hid food under his pillow because he was afraid he wouldn't be given any the next day. She told him all this while she was packing his things, and he listened in silence, memorizing every word. Prince Lee Do-hyun, the fifth son of Emperor Lee Ju-hwan. 20 years old, his magical channels had been broken since he was 4. The court considered him feeble-minded. His 4 older brothers shared the throne and took no notice of him. For the past year he had barely eaten. 3 days ago, he was found unconscious in the garden in the rain. No one came except Grandmother Park, and now the decree, Chorsan, a small copper and coal town in the mountains at the very edge of the empire, 400 residents, a ruined mine, a collapsed dam. They'd even stopped collecting taxes from there 10 years ago. Formally, it was called an appointment as governor. In reality, they'd thrown him out of the palace like a broken object. Grandmother Park spoke about it in an even voice, but her hands were trembling again. Do-yoon listened and mapped out the scene in his mind. A copper mine, coal, a mountain river with a collapsed dam. 400 people. This wasn't a punishment. These were resources. The journey to Chorsan took 11 days. They were given a single cart without magical levitation, an ordinary wooden cart pulled by an ox. A convoy of 2 soldiers escorted them to the border of the capital province and turned back without even saying goodbye. From there, they traveled alone. Just Yoon, Grandma Park, and a single trunk of belongings. The road wound upward into the mountains through scattered villages. In every village, people would glance at the cart and then look away. No one bowed. They don't bow to a prince without magic. Do-yoon put those 11 days to good use. He studied his body. His muscles were weak, but his bones were intact. His eyesight was good. After a few days of exercise, his coordination became acceptable. He could walk without assistance and hold a writing brush. Nothing more was needed for now. He asked Grandma Park about everything. What metals were mined in the empire? What ores were found in Chorsan? How a magic lamp worked? How much copper cost? How much glass cost? Is there clay in the mountains suitable for firing? Grandma Park didn't know even half the answers, but she knew something else. She knew that Prince Do-hyun, in all 20 years of his life, had never asked as many questions as this new Do-hyun had asked in a single day. She didn't ask what had happened to him. She simply began to answer in greater detail. On the 6th day of their journey, they stopped at a blacksmith's village to repair the wagon's axle. Do-yoon went into the smithy. He saw a forge, bellows, an anvil, and a set of tools that likely hadn't changed in this world for 1,000 years. The blacksmith worked by eye, without taking measurements. Every detail was unique. No two horseshoes were alike. Do-yoon stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, watching in silence. Then he walked over to a pile of scrap metal in the corner. There lay scraps of copper greenish, twisted pieces of varying sizes. He asked the blacksmith how much the whole pile cost. The blacksmith looked at his clothes, then at his thin arms. Then he named a price 3 times higher than the actual value. Do-yoon paid without haggling. Grandma Park took the last of the silver out of the wagon and handed it over with an expression as if she were burying a relative. Do-yoon loaded the copper into the cart and told her that this silver would return to her 100-fold. She looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. But that evening, for the first time in 11 days, she prepared dinner for him with a smile. On the 11th day, they saw Chorsan. The town lay in a narrow mountain valley between 2 ridges. A river flowed through the valley from north to south. The remains of a stone dam stood in the river. 3/4 of the masonry had collapsed, and the water flowed freely over the rubble. The houses in town were made of stone with wooden roofs. Half the roofs had caved in. There was only one main street. About 30 houses stood along it. At the end of the street stood the governor's house, a 2-story building with a collapsed porch. The windows were intact but so dirty that nothing could be seen through them. People were standing in the square in front of the house, about 30 of them. They were waiting for the new governor. Do-yoon climbed down from the wagon and looked at them. They were thin. Their clothes had been patched several times. 2 of the men were missing arms. One woman's face was scarred by an old mine gas burn. The children were hiding behind their mothers' backs. No one bowed. An old man stepped forward. He introduced himself as village head Kong Taeson. He said there were 412 residents in the town, that the mine had been closed for 3 years, that in winter the elderly and children die from the cold, that the last governor left 2 months ago and never returned. He said all this in the even tone of a man who expects nothing good. Do-yoon listened to him and looked at the river, at the remains of the dam, at the dark mine entrances on the mountainside, at the coppery green on the rocks by the water. Then he turned to the village elder and said he needed 3 things: people who know how to work with stone, people who know the mine from the inside, and someone who could show him where flax grows. The village elder looked at him for a few seconds. Then he asked why the governor needed flax. Do-yoon replied that flax could be used to make insulation for wires. The village head didn't understand a single one of those words, but for the first time in 3 years, he saw a governor who didn't ask where he could get a drink, but instead asked where he could find work. He nodded and led him into town. For the first 2 days, Do-yoon didn't sleep. He walked all over Chorsan from one end to the other. He went down into the mine with a lantern made from an oil-soaked rag. The mine was in decent condition. There were 3 main tunnels. The wooden supports needed replacing but weren't rotten. A copper vein ran along the eastern wall of the main tunnel in a wide band. Next to the copper, he found zinc. Next to the zinc, he found traces of lead. He climbed back to the surface and headed toward the river. The elevation difference at the site of the collapsed dam was approximately 4 meters. The water flow was decent even in the summer. In the winter, the river did not freeze because hot springs upstream warmed the water. That was important. It meant the water wheel would operate year-round. He examined the ruins of the dam. The masonry was built with lime mortar. The collapse wasn't due to age, but because someone had pulled out an artifact stone from the dam that had reinforced the structure. Without magic, the dam had stood for half a year before collapsing. Do-yoon sat down on a rock by the water and smiled. He didn't need magic. What he needed was a proper load calculation and cement mortar. He could get the cement from limestone, of which there was plenty in the mountains. He returned to the governor's house and began to draw up plans. Grandma Park brought him tea and a bowl of porridge. He ate with his left hand without taking his eyes off the drawing in his right. She stood in the doorway and watched him. On the table in front of him lay a sheet of paper on which was drawn a water wheel connected to something she had never seen before. A coil of copper wire between two pieces of iron. Next to it was a caption in his handwriting, "Generator." She didn't know what that word meant. But she could see that for the first time in 20 years, this boy was on fire, not with mana, but with something else. The third evening in Chorsan. The governor's house was shrouded in darkness. The only magic lamp had burned out long ago, and the Beck clan, which had a monopoly on the production of artifact light, hadn't sent a replacement. Grandmother Park sat by the window, trying to embroider by candlelight. Her eyes weren't what they used to be. She squinted and held the fabric right up to her face. Do-yoon watched her from the doorway. Then he silently went out to the shed. He spent 2 hours there. He took a copper basin. He found a piece of oiled silk. He took a jar of brine from pickled vegetables out of the chest. He removed a zinc plate from the old roof of the governor's house. He unwound the wire from a torn chainmail shirt that was hanging in the storeroom. He returned with a clay bowl in his hands. The dish contained salt water and 2 metal plates. 2 strands of wire ran from the plates to a thin strand of charcoal held in a glass medicine bottle. He sucked the air out of the bottle with his mouth through a straw and sealed the opening with wax, roughly, crookedly, but he knew it would work for at least a minute. He set the dish on the table next to Grandma Park. She looked up. He closed the circuit. The carbon filament glowed with a warm orange light. Not bright, a candle was brighter, but this light was steady. It didn't flicker, and it wasn't magical. Grandma Park dropped her prayer beads. She stared at the little flame inside the glass bulb and couldn't say a word. Do-yoon sat across from her, watching her over the top of his first light bulb in this world. He told her to keep embroidering. He said he'd make her a lamp that would stay lit until morning. All he needed was a week and some more copper. The light bulb burned for 6 minutes. Grandma Park cried for all 6 of them. When the filament burned out and the light went out, she wiped her face with her sleeve, looked at him, and said he didn't look like the boy she'd raised. He replied that he wasn't that boy, but he was the one who would make sure she never had to cry in the dark again. She was silent for a long time. Then she said it didn't matter to her who he was. She would be there for him. It was the first night that Nam Do-yoon, in the body of Prince Lee Do-hyeon, felt that he had a home. The next morning, Do-yoon woke up before dawn. He was lying on a hard straw mat in the governor's room, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing. He needed a plan, not a dream or a fantasy, but a concrete plan with a sequence of steps and deadlines. First, people need food. Without well-fed workers, there will be no mine, no dam, and no generator. Second, he needs a large quantity of copper, wire for windings, plates for components, sheets for casings. Third, he needs a magnet, a permanent magnet strong enough for the generator. Without a magnet, all his electrical equipment is just a toy. He stood up and went out into the yard. Grandma Park had already lit the hearth. She set a bowl of porridge and a cup of hot water in front of him. He ate and thought. Then he called for the village head, Kang Tae-son. The village head arrived half an hour later. 2 others came with him. Kim Dae-soo, the miner's foreman, a burly man in his 40s with sunburned hands and a stern gaze, and his daughter, Kim Ha-in, 17 years old, a freckled face. She wore a men's work jacket over a patched dress. She stood behind her father and looked at Do-yoon with an expression he'd seen before on first-year college students, a mixture of distrust and eager curiosity. Do-yoon seated them at the table and began to speak. He spoke simply. He said that Chorsan was not a place of exile, but his home. He said he intended to restore the mine and the dam. He said he needed workers and that everyone who worked would be paid, not promises, but copper and silver. The village head listened in silence. Then he asked how Do-yoon intended to pay them if the governor had no money. Do-yoon replied that the money was in the mountain. Copper was money. They just had to get it out. Foreman Kim Dae-soo cleared his throat and said that the mine was closed because, without magical reinforcement of the walls, the tunnels would crumble within a month. Do-yoon nodded. He asked if there was any good clay in the vicinity. The foreman said there was plenty of clay on the southern slope. Do-yoon said that using clay and limestone, he would make a mortar that would hold the walls just as well as magic. The foreman looked at him as if he were crazy. Hyun, standing behind him, leaned forward. Work began that very day. Do-yoon divided the men into 3 groups. First group, 20 men to the limestone quarry. They would burn lime in a simple kiln that Do-yoon had sketched out in half an hour. Second group, 15 men to clear the main mine tunnel. No mining, just clearing and installing new support. Third group, 10 men to the river, clearing rocks at the site of the future water wheel. He didn't bother rebuilding the entire dam. That would have taken months. Instead, he chose a narrow spot further downstream where the rocks narrowed the riverbed. Here, a 2-meter drop and the natural water pressure were sufficient. The water wheel could be installed without a dam, simply using the speed of the current. Kane stood next to him as he explained to the crew exactly where to dig. She listened more attentively than anyone else. When he finished, she asked why he needed a water wheel if there was no mill in town. He looked at her and said, the wheel wouldn't be for grinding flour. It would spin a coil of copper wire between 2 magnets, and that would generate energy. She asked what kind of energy. He said it would be the same kind of energy that lit the light bulb last night, but 1,000 times more. Hayne was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said she wanted to help. He asked if she knew how to count. She said she could count to 1,000 and add 3-digit numbers in her head. He said that would be enough to start with. By the end of the first week, the kiln had produced its first batch of lime. Do-yoon mixed it with clay and water in proportions he knew by heart. The result was a coarse cement. Not perfect, it had bubbles and lumps. But when, 3 days later, it had set on the test stone and Foreman Kim struck it with a pickaxe with all his might, and the pickaxe bounced off while the stone didn't even crack, Foreman Kim sat down on the ground and remained silent for a very long time. Then he stood up and asked how much of this mortar was needed for the tunnels. Do-yoon said a lot. The foreman nodded, and the next day, not 20 but 40 men went out to the limestone quarry. Volunteers, without orders. The problem with the magnet remained. The generator needed a permanent magnet, strong enough that a copper coil would generate a current when rotated within its magnetic field. People in this world knew about magnets. They were called living stones and were used in compasses, but compass magnets were tiny. He needed a piece of magnetite the size of 2 fists. Do-yoon asked the village head where the nearest deposits of magnetic stone were. The village head didn't know. Foreman Kim didn't know. No one in town knew. But Hyun came to him that evening with a piece of black stone wrapped in a rag. She said she'd found it 3 years ago on the northern slope. The stone was heavy and attracted iron filings. She'd kept it as a toy because she liked watching the filings form patterns around it. Do-yoon took the stone. He held an iron nail up to it. The nail jumped toward the stone and stuck to it. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them and asked Hyun if she could show him that spot. She said she could. He said they would go tomorrow at dawn. Hyun smiled. It was the first smile he'd seen in Chorsan, not counting Grandma Park. The northern slope turned out to be an hour and a half's walk from the city. The trail wound through a pine forest up the ridge. Hyun walked ahead. Do-young followed behind her, gasping for breath. Prince Do-yeon's body was weak. His legs were already trembling after the first climb. Hyun glanced back at him and slowed her pace without saying a word. They reached a scattering of dark stones at the edge of a ravine. Do-yoon crouched down and began examining the stones one by one, holding a piece of iron up to each one. Out of 20 stones, 5 turned out to be magnetic. 2 of them were larger than his fist. That was enough. He sat down right on the ground next to the stones and laughed. Haeyeon stood nearby, looking down at him. She said she'd never seen a grown man laugh at stones. He replied that they weren't stones. They were the future. She didn't understand, but she remembered. The second week. The water wheel. Do-yoon built it out of oak. The oak grew in the forest higher up the slope, and the carpenters of Chorsan knew how to work with it. The wheel turned out rough. The blades were uneven, the axle creaked, but it turned. Water pounded against the blades, and the wheel spun with stubborn regularity. Do-yoon stood on the bank, wet up to his waist, watching it. The entire crew stood nearby. They watched the spinning wheel and didn't understand why it was needed if there was nowhere to grind grain. He didn't bother to explain. He simply asked them to help lift a wooden frame with a coil secured inside onto the axle. 300 turns of copper wire wound by hand over 5 nights. His fingers were scraped raw from the work. Hyun had been winding the wire with him for the last 2 nights. She counted the turns aloud and never lost count once. The coil was mounted on the axle between 2 pieces of magnetite secured in the wooden frame. Do-yoon ran 2 copper wires from the coil to a small light bulb, just like the first one, a glass bulb with a carbon filament. Only this time, the source of current wasn't a jar of brine, but the river. The water turned the wheel turned the coil rotated in the magnetic field, and current flowed through the wires. The filament in the bulb lit up, brighter than the first time. Much brighter. It glowed with a steady, warm light and didn't go out. 1 minute. 2, 5, 10 minutes. The hair didn't burn out because the current was more steady than that from a battery. Foreman Kim Dae-soo looked at the glowing bulb, then at the river, and then back at the bulb. He said that this thing draws light from the water. Do-yoon said not exactly from the water, from motion. The foreman said he didn't understand. Do-yoon said he would understand. Everyone would understand. He just needed time. That evening, he brought light to 3 houses, the governor's house, the village head's house, and the maternity ward. In the maternity ward, the light bulb burned all night. For the first time in 20 years of work, midwife Moon Yeon-hee delivered a baby under bright light. She saw everything, every stitch, every movement. The baby was born healthy. The mother survived. At dawn, the midwife went out into the street, sat down on the steps, and wept. She said that if she'd had this light 10 years ago, 8 children would still be alive. Do-yoon stood in the doorway and heard her words. He didn't reply. He returned to the workshop and began sketching a second coil, a larger one, with 1,000 turns. Yeon sat beside him, smoothing the copper wire with a file to make it straighter. She didn't ask any questions. She just worked, and he thought that in his past life, over the course of 20 years, he hadn't met a single assistant who understood, without words, what needed to be done next. But this girl from the mining town had figured it out in a week. By the beginning of the 3rd week, Chorsan had begun to change. You could tell by the little things. People walked faster, they spoke louder. Children who used to hide behind houses were now running to the river to watch the water wheel. They stood on the bank and counted the revolutions. A girl of about 8 asked Do-yoon why the wheel didn't stop. He crouched down in front of her and explained that the water pushes the blades and that water always flows because it falls from above. The girl asked, "And who pushes the water up?" He smiled and said, "The sun. The sun heats the water in the ocean. The water rises into the sky. It falls as rain on the mountains and flows down the river." The girl thought for a moment and said, "So that means the sun makes the wheel turn." Do-yoon stood up and looked at her very seriously. He said she was absolutely right. Hyun stood nearby and remembered this conversation. She would later tell him that it was at that very moment that she understood. He doesn't just build things, he builds a different way of thinking. The mine began operating on the 20th day, not at full capacity, 1 tunnel, 12 miners, but the copper was flowing. The first pieces of ore were brought to the surface, and Foreman Kim personally carried the largest piece to the governor's house and placed it on the table in front of Do-yoon. The ore was rich, green with red veins. Do-yoon weighed it in his hand and estimated the content. 30% pure copper. That was excellent. Now he needed a smelter. He built it in 4 days. A clay-lined furnace with bellows. Nothing complicated. It was the kind of thing you'd find in any first-year metallurgy textbook, but there were no textbooks here. Here, there were people who smelted copper in pits filled with coal and ended up with spongy metal full of bubbles and slag. Duyun showed them how to add flux, how to control the temperature by the color of the flame, how to pour the molten metal into molds. The first smelting yielded a copper ingot weighing 3 jin, pure, dense, bubble-free. Foreman Kim picked it up and turned it over in his hands. Then he looked at Do-yoon and, for the first time, called him not a deputy, but a master. That meant more than any title. But along with the work came problems. On the 23rd day, a side tunnel in the mine collapsed. No one was killed, but 2 workers were buried up to their waists. They were dug out in 2 hours. One had a broken leg, the other got off with bruises. Du Yong went down into the mine himself and inspected the site of the collapse. The cement wasn't to blame. The walls held. The ceiling had collapsed in an old, unworked tunnel where the workers had ventured without permission in search of a new vein. Do-yoon came to the surface and gathered everyone. He didn't shout. He spoke quietly, and that was more terrifying than a shout. He said that in the mine, no one was allowed to go anywhere not marked on the map. He said that every new tunnel would first be inspected and reinforced. He said that every worker would be assigned a number, and that number would be recorded upon entry and exit. If a person went in and didn't come out within the allotted time, a search party would be sent in. This is called safety protocol. Here, they didn't know those words. Here, people simply died and considered it a normal price to pay for the ore. Do-yoon said that this was an unreasonable price and that he wasn't going to pay it. The workers listened in silence. Foreman Kim stood nearby and nodded. He had lost his brother in this mine 15 years ago, a cave-in. They found the body a week later. He never spoke of it, but everyone knew. On the 25th day, another problem arose. Food. The grain reserves in Chorsan were running low. It was a 3-day journey to the nearest trading town. There was no money. The copper hadn't yet been processed into a product that could be sold. Do-yoon sat at the table and did the math. 412 mouths to feed. At least half a kilo of grain per person per day. That's 206 kilos a day. Supplies would last 10 more days. In 10 days, people would start starving, and then no generators or light bulbs would help. He thought for 3 hours. Then he went outside and walked to the river. He looked at the water. There were fish in the water, mountain trout, lots of them. The river was full of fish that no one caught on an industrial scale because people didn't have nets. They had fishing rods and woven baskets. That was enough for a few families, but not for the whole town. Do-yoon returned to his workshop. He sketched a design he remembered from his childhood. His grandfather, in a village near Gyeongju, would set these up on the river every fall. A versha, a trap woven from willow twigs with a funnel-shaped entrance. The fish swim inside and cannot find their way out. Simple and foolproof. In 2 days, the workers wove 20 versha. They set them up in the river at the rapids. On the morning of the first day, they hauled in 40 kilograms of fish. On the morning of the second, 60. By the end of the week, Chorsan was eating fish 3 times a day. Not to his fill, but his hunger had subsided. Grandmother Park salted fish for later and grumbled that the governor's house smelled like a fishing village. Do-yoon said that a fishing village smelled of life, and that was the best smell in the world. Along with the food, he was working on the soap problem. He knew that without hygiene, any settlement was doomed. Dysentery, wound infections, childbed fever, all of these killed people just as much as hunger. Soap, the simplest lye, soap, ash plus fat. He obtained the lye from wood ash in a single day. Fat was a problem. There were few animals in Chorsan. The cows were skinny. There were no pigs. But the fish provided fat. Not much, but enough for the first batch. He boiled the soap in a large cauldron in the backyard of the governor's house. The smell was awful. Grandma Park held her nose and walked to the other end of the street. Yeon stayed and helped stir. She asked why they were doing this. He said it killed invisible creatures that caused diseases. She asked what kind of creatures. He thought for a second. Then he said that creatures so small they were invisible to the eye lived in water and mud. They get into wounds and into the mouth and into the blood, and because of them, people get sick and die. Soap kills them. Hyen looked at her hands, at her black fingernails, at the dirt caked into her skin. She didn't say anything. She went to the water barrel and washed her hands with the first bar of soap until her skin turned red. She washed them for a very long time. He instituted a rule. Everyone who handles food must wash their hands before work. Everyone who works in the mine must wash their hands after work. In the maternity ward, hands must be washed before and after every touch. Midwife Moon-Yan-hee resisted at first. She said she'd been delivering babies for 30 years without soap, and nothing had ever happened. Do-yoon didn't argue. He simply showed her the records he'd been keeping since day one. In 3 weeks of using soap and clean water, there had been not a single infection, not a single fever, not a single death. The midwife looked at the records, she looked at her own hands, and she began washing them every time, silently, with the expression of someone who'd just been slapped in the face with the truth. 1 month, the end of the first month in Chorsan. Do-yoon stood on the roof of the governor's house and looked down at the city from above. The mine was operating, the smelter was smoking, the water wheel was turning. 3 houses were lit by electric light. Fish were drying on racks by the river. Children were running down the street. He did the math in his head. Not a single person had died in a month. Not from illness, not from hunger, not from a cave-in. For a city where 2 people had died every month for the past 3 years, this was a miracle. Only he knew it wasn't a miracle. It was soap and boiled water and safety protocols and rafts on the river. The simplest things, the most basic knowledge, the kind of thing children are taught in school in his world. Here, no one knew any of it. And that made him feel both happy and scared at the same time. Happy because he could help. Scared because he understood how many people had died over the past 1,000 years simply because no one knew they needed to wash their hands. Hyen came to his workshop that evening. She brought a wooden board on which she had drawn a diagram of the generator with charcoal from memory after seeing it just once. The coil was in the right place. The magnets were in the right place. The wires were going where they needed to go. Only the proportions were wrong. The coil was too small relative to the magnets. Do-yoon looked at the drawing, then at her, then back at the drawing. He sat down next to her and began to explain. He explained for 2 hours what a magnetic field is, what induction is, why current flows when a conductor moves through a field. He drew on the board, he erased, he drew again. Ha-in listened without blinking. She asked questions that made him pause and think. She asked why current flows only when a conductor moves. Why doesn't it flow when it's stationary? He said it was a law of nature. She asked who had written that law. He said a man named Faraday. She asked if he was a magician. Do-yoon laughed and said no. He was the son of a blacksmith. The second month began with visitors. At dawn, a sentry at the entrance to the valley spotted a caravan, 3 wagons and 10 horsemen in blue cloaks, the Pak clan. Do-yoon recognized their crest from Grandmother Pak's description, a white crane on a blue field. The Pak clan controlled the production of magic lamps and lighting artifacts throughout the empire. Every light source in Hasen passed through their hands, and they had come to see the man who had lit a lamp without their permission. The leader of the party introduced himself as Inspector Boak Sonu, a man in his 50s, dressed in expensive clothing with heavy rings on every finger. He walked into the governor's house as if it were his own. He sat down without being invited. He looked at the electric light bulb glowing on the table and remained silent for a long time. Then he said that rumors had reached them. They say that the 5th prince, in his remote backwater, is burning some kind of lights without mana. They say it's heresy. They say the priests of the Bright Path are already drafting a denunciation. He had come in person to verify it. Do-yoon sat across from him. He wasn't nervous. He'd been preparing for this visit since the first week. He knew the clans would come. The only question was when. He calmly explained that it wasn't heresy. It was fire. Ordinary fire, like that from a candle. only it was enclosed in glass and fueled not by wax, but by the energy of water. Inspector Bayek stared at him without blinking. Then he asked if the prince intended to sell these lamps outside of Chorsan. Do-yoon said he had no such plans, for now. Inspector Beck took note of that word. He stood up and said he would report to the clan leader. He recommended leaving the prince alone for now, because his toys were just that, toys. Who needs light in a hole that holds 400 people? He left that same day. Do-yoon stood by the window and watched the caravan recede into the distance. He knew the inspector was wrong, and he knew the inspector would realize his mistake too late. 3 days after Baek's visit, another guest arrived. A lone rider on a weary horse, a young woman in a traveling dress, dusty beyond recognition. So-ari, 19 years old, Prince Lee Do-hyun's political fiancée, arranged 3 years earlier under a treaty between the impoverished So clan and the royal chancellery. When the prince was exiled to Chorsan, no one called off the engagement. The So clan didn't care. They sent her after him like damaged goods following broken furniture. She arrived alone, without an entourage, without a dowry except for a small chest of books. Do-yoon was standing on the porch when she dismounted. She was thin, with dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were calloused from the reins. She looked up at him and introduced herself in a steady voice that held neither hope nor fear, just exhaustion. She said she had come to fulfill her duty as the 5th prince's bride. She said she expected neither love nor attention from him, and asked only for a roof over her head and a bowl of food. She spoke as if reading from a prepared speech. She had been preparing for the worst the entire journey. Do-yoon looked at her in silence. Then he said she would receive a roof over her head and food, and besides, if she didn't mind, he'd like to offer her a job. So, Ari fell silent for 5 seconds. Then she asked again, "Ye job?" He led her into the house. Grandma Park fed her rice and fish and poured her some hot tea. So Ari ate slowly and carefully. While she ate, she looked around the room. A light bulb on the table, stacks of papers with drawings, strange tools made of copper and wood. On the wall, a hand-drawn map of Chorsan with markings she didn't understand. Do-yoon waited until she had finished eating. Then he placed a notebook in front of her, a blank one, and a writing brush. He said he needed someone to keep a log of the experiments, to record every experiment, every result, every failure, accurately and in detail, with dates and numbers. He asked if it was true that she had good handwriting. She replied that her handwriting was considered the best among the daughters of the So clan. He nodded. He said that this would be her job. The pay would be separate from her allowance as a wife. This wasn't charity, it was employment. So, Ari looked at the notebook, then at him. Something flickered in her eyes. She asked why he needed to record the failures. He replied that failures were more important than successes. Failure tells you exactly what isn't working. Success only tells you that you got lucky today. She was silent. Then she took the notebook with both hands and pressed it to her chest. She said she would start tomorrow. Grandma Park stood in the doorway watching them. There was a smile on her face that Do-yoon had never seen before, not a sad one, but a genuine one. So Ari got to work the next day and, within a week, became indispensable. Do-yoon realized this when she came to him with her first completed logbook. The entries were flawless: date, experiment title, materials, conditions, and results. But in addition to that, she'd added a column of her own. Consumption. How much copper was used? How much coal? How many hours of work? Do-yoon looked at that column and realized that this woman thought like a manager. She wasn't just counting the work done, but also how much it cost. He asked how she knew that. She replied that in the So clan, women weren't allowed to handle business matters. But for 10 years, she had secretly read her father's trade ledgers. She knew the markups on copper across all the provinces. She knew which goods traveled along which trade routes. She knew the seasonal fluctuations in the prices of grain and cloth. She knew all of this, but couldn't put it to use because she was a daughter, not a son. Do-yun listened and nodded. Then he placed a second journal in front of her. He said this journal was for keeping track of all of Chorsan's resources, incoming and outgoing, every piece of copper, every sack of grain, every day of work for every person. She would keep complete records of the province's economy. So Ari took the second ledger. This time she didn't press it to her chest. She placed it on the table, opened it, and began to write. She worked until midnight. Grandmother Park brought her tea 3 times. 2 weeks after So-Ari's arrival in Chorsan, the first real incident occurred. Do-yun was working on improving the generator. He wanted to increase its power so he could connect more houses. To do this, he needed a coil with a higher number of turns and stronger magnets. He calculated the new configuration and began assembling it. He worked for 2 days straight with almost no sleep. Hai-in helped with the winding. So-Ari recorded every step. When the new generator was ready, Do-yun connected it to the wheel. The coil began to spin. Current flowed. The light bulbs flashed brighter than before. Do-yun began connecting additional lines. The 4th house, the 5th, the 6th. At the 7th house, something clicked. A wire in one of the connections overheated, and the oiled flax braiding began to smoke. Do-yun rushed to the circuit breaker and cut the circuit. The wire was already smoldering. Another 10 seconds and the village head's house would have caught fire. He stood over the scorched connection, breathing heavily. Hyun stood beside him, trembling. He crouched down and examined the damage. Overload. He had connected too many loads to a wire with too small a gauge. A basic mistake. A rookie mistake. He knew that formula by heart. The wire gauge must match the load. He had calculated the load incorrectly because he hadn't slept for 2 days and was in a hurry. He gathered all the workers that evening. He showed them the scorched wire. He said it was his mistake. He said he had miscalculated the load and nearly burned down the house. He said that every wire in the city would be re-examined and every connection checked. The workers looked at him. They had never seen a magistrate admit his mistake in front of ordinary people. Village chief Kang Tae-seon said there had been 7 magistrates in Chorsan before him. Not a single one had ever apologized to anyone. Do-yun replied that he wasn't apologizing. He was reporting the facts. A mistake isn't a reason to apologize. It's a reason to correct it. They would fix it and move on. So-Ari recorded this episode in her journal. In the result column, she wrote a single word. Lesson. 2nd month, 3rd week. Vernier caliper. Do-yun sat in the workshop and carved it out of wood and copper. 2 slats with jaws, a movable scale, vernier. Accurate to 0.5 millimeter, rough by the standards of his former world, but here it was like giving sight to a blind man. He made 5 of them in 3 days. He gave them to the foreman. He showed them how to use them. He explained what a millimeter was. They didn't know. In the Hasan Empire, length was measured with fingers, palms, and elbows. Each blacksmith worked according to his own standards. A part made by one wouldn't fit a product made by another. Do-yun drew a ruler on the workshop wall. 1 meter divided into 10 parts. Each part was divided into 10 more. He said that from now on, every part in Chorsan would have its size recorded as a number, not by eye, but by number. Foreman Kim looked at the ruler and the vernier caliper. Then, without a word, he picked up the tool and went down into the mine. A day later, he returned and said he had measured all the support beams in the main tunnel. 4 of them were 2 fingers thinner than the rest. Before, he wouldn't have noticed. Now he could see it. Do-yun sent people to replace those beams that very same day. The foreman said that the vernier caliper had saved the mine from collapsing. Do-yun said that Foreman Kim had saved the mine because he went and measured them. A tool without a person is just a piece of copper. Hee-in took 1 vernier caliper for herself and didn't let it out of her hands for a week. She measured everything: the thickness of the wire, the diameter of the pipes, the width of the gap in the generator. She started a notebook and wrote down all the measurements. Do-yun looked at her notes a week later. and found a pattern she had noticed before he did. The wire in the generator's winding varied in thickness at different points. Where the wire was thinner, it heated up more. Hyun marked this with a red dot in her notebook. She didn't know why this happened, but she saw the pattern. Do-yoon sat down next to her and explained. Thinner wire has greater resistance. Greater resistance means more heat for the same current. That's a law. Ohm's law, current equals voltage divided by resistance. He wrote the formula on the board. Hae-in looked at it. 3 letters. 3 quantities. 1 simple relationship. She asked if all laws were that simple. He replied that the most important ones were the end of the 2nd month. Copper production was steady. The smelter was producing 2 ingots a day. Do-yoon began making wire. He needed a wire drawing machine, a board with holes of varying diameters through which a copper rod is drawn. Each pass through a smaller hole made the wire thinner and longer. He carved the drawing board out of hardened iron. The first board cracked, the second held up. Through it, he pulled the first meter of smooth copper wire, uniform in thickness along its entire length. Hein measured it with a vernier caliper. The deviation was less than 1/4 of a millimeter. Do-yoon nodded. Now he could wind coils from wire of uniform cross-section. This meant the generator would run more smoothly and predictably. This meant he could calculate the load. This meant last week's fire would not happen again. The first day of the 3rd month, Do-yoon convened a council meeting. 5 people sat at the table in the governor's house. Village chief Kang Tae-seon, foreman Kim Dae-soo, Kim Ha-in, So-ari, Grandma Park. Grandma Park sat in the corner, knitting. She wasn't technically a member of the council, but no one dared ask her to leave, and everyone knew she was listening to every word. Do-yoon spread a plan out on the table, a large sheet of paper depicting Chorsan as it would look in 6 months. The dam has been restored, not completely, but enough to raise the water level by 2 meters and install a second water wheel. 2 generators, electricity in every home. The smelter has been expanded, a second furnace, a wire drawing shop, the first telephone line from the mine to the governor's residence. So-ari asked what a telephone line was. Do-yoon explained. 2 wires stretched between 2 points, a device at each end. If you press the button at one end, a bell rings at the other end. This means that the foreman in the mine can instantly signal to the surface that he needs help. No need to run through the tunnels for half an hour. Just press the button. Foreman Kim looked at Do-yoon, then at the diagram. Then he said quietly that if he'd had such a thing 15 years ago, his brother might still be alive. The room fell silent. Grandma Park stopped knitting. Do-yoon nodded and said that was exactly why they would build it. They would start tomorrow. It took a week to lay the bell line, a copper wire strung on wooden poles from the mine entrance to the governor's house. 220 meters. Hae-in calculated the length of the wire. Together with Ari, she figured out how much copper they'd need. Foreman Kim personally dug in the first pole. Do-yoon assembled 2 simple switches, a copper plate on a spring. When pressed, it closes the circuit. At the other end of the circuit, an electromagnet pulls an iron hammer toward the bell. A basic circuit, a simplified version of Morse code. Only without the code, just a bell. There's either a signal or no signal. When the line was ready, Do-yoon stood by the switch in the governor's house. Ha-in stood by the switch in the mine. He pressed the plate. A bell rang in the mine. Ha-in pressed her plate. A bell rang in response at the governor's house. Grandma Park dropped her knitting. She walked over to the bell and looked at it. Then she looked at the wall, beyond which neither the mine nor Ha-in could be seen. She asked how a girl could ring the bell here when she was so far away. Do-yoon explained that an invisible force flows through the wire. When Hein presses the button, the force travels along the wire and strikes the bell, just as water flows through a pipe. Grandma Park looked at the wire leading out the window, then at the bell, then at Do-yoon. She said it looked more like magic than anything she'd seen in 62 years. Do-yoon smiled and said it wasn't magic. It was physics. She replied that she didn't see the difference. He laughed. She laughed too. It was a good day. But the good times didn't last. The next morning, a boy from the patrols came running. He was gasping for breath and could barely speak. A detachment was moving along the southern road toward Chorsan. 15 horsemen in red cloaks, priests of the bright path. Do-yoon stood on the porch and listened to the boy. Then he turned to So-eri, who was standing nearby, a magazine in her hands. He asked what she knew about the priests of the bright path. She replied in an even voice, "The priests of the bright path are the empire's religious guardians. They ensure that no one uses powers not sanctified by the teachings of mana as the breath of heaven. Any device that operates without mana is declared heresy. The punishment for heresy depends on the province. In the capital, it is confiscation of property. In the provinces, it can be execution." So Ari spoke all this in the same even tone, and her expression didn't change at the word execution. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. So had Do-yoon. He summoned Foreman Kim and the village head. He gave his orders: cover the generator by the river with a mat, remove the wires from the governor's house to the mine. Take down the light bulbs, hide all traces of electricity within 2 hours. The men worked quickly. They didn't ask why. They already understood that in this world there are things that must not be shown. The priests arrived around noon. Their leader was a tall, gaunt man with a white beard and cold eyes. He did not give his name. He said he had come on behalf of the high priest Hwang Gi-chol to investigate rumors of unnatural fires in Chorsan. Do-yoon received him in the governor's residence. An ordinary candle stood on the table. No light bulbs, no wires. The priest surveyed the room. His gaze settled on the wall where, just that morning, a map with markings had been hanging. Do-yoon had taken it down an hour before their arrival. A slightly lighter rectangle of unburned paint remained on the wall. The priest looked at this rectangle, then at Do-yoon. Do-yoon held his gaze. The priest said he'd heard that the prince lit fires without mana. Do-yoon replied that he lit candles. There it was. Burning. The priest said it wasn't about candles. It was about strange devices made of copper and glass. Do-yoon said he had copper utensils and glass vials from medicine bottles. If the priest wanted, he could search the entire house. The priest searched. Every room, every storage room, every corner. He found nothing because Hae-gin and Foreman Kim had spent an hour and a half hiding everything in an abandoned mine shaft, a place the priests wouldn't venture into even for silver. The priest returned to the main room. He stood before Do-yoon and said nothing. Then he said that next time he would come without warning, and that if he found any unnatural devices, Chorsan would be purified. Do-yoon asked what purified meant. The priest replied that it meant burned. He turned and left. The 15 horsemen rode off to the south, leaving behind the scent of incense and a threat. Do-yoon stood on the porch and watched the dust kicked up by their horses. So-eri stood beside him. She said that next time they wouldn't have time to hide everything. Do-yoon nodded. He said that meant they didn't need to hide anything. They needed to make sure there was no need to hide anything. She asked how. He replied that there were 2 ways. First, become so strong that the priests wouldn't dare touch him. Second, become so useful that someone stronger than the priests would come to his defense. She thought for a moment and said the second way was faster. He looked at her and, for the first time ever, saw not a fiancée or a secretary but an ally. He said she was right and that he needed goods. Something that could be sold beyond the borders of Chorsan. Something so valuable that the merchant clans would have a stake in his survival. So So-eri said one word: wire, copper wire of uniform thickness. Nothing like it existed in the Hysan Empire. Every blacksmith drew wire by hand, and every piece was a different thickness. Standard, uniformly calibrated wire would cost 10 times as much as ordinary wire, and everyone would want it: jewelers, gunsmiths, artifact craftsmen. Even the Baek clan. Do-yoon stared at her in silence. Then he said she had just earned 3 months' worth of her salary in advance. So-eri allowed herself a small smile. Her first in a long time. That evening, Do-yoon sat alone in the workshop. He wasn't thinking about wire or priests. He was thinking about the old priest's words, unnatural fires. To them, his light was unnatural, against nature, against the law of the world. He sat there, staring at the candle, and he thought about how every technological revolution in human history had begun with someone declaring a new kind of fire to be heresy. Then came the people who were cold, and they chose warmth every single time. He blew out the candle. He pulled a hidden light bulb from under the workbench. He connected it to a small battery. The light flared up, warm, steady, not magical. He sat in that light and sketched a diagram of a wire drawing machine for mass-producing wire. In the morning, he would show this drawing to Hain. She would understand. She always understands. The priests had left, but their shadow remained. Do-yoon realized he had maybe 2 months, maybe 3. Then they would return, and next time they wouldn't knock on the door. He sat at the table and looked at the drawing of the wire drawing machine. So Ari sat across from him, flipping through her ledger. She looked up and said they had 40 copper ingots left. That would be enough for 300 meters of wire if they drew it through the drawing board by hand. 300 meters wasn't enough. For a commercial shipment, they needed at least 3,000. Do-yoon nodded. He said they wouldn't be able to manage it by hand. They needed a machine, a wire drawing machine powered by a water wheel. He unfolded the blueprint and showed it to her. A wooden frame, a pulley system, a clamp that pulls a copper rod through a hole in a hardened steel plate. The force is generated by the water wheel via a drive shaft. One worker can draw as much wire in a day as 10 craftsmen can in a week. So Ari looked at the blueprint. Then she took out a notebook and began to calculate copper consumption, wood consumption for the frame, number of labor hours for assembly. She calculated faster than he expected. 10 minutes later, she looked up and said that the machine would pay for itself in 2 weeks of trade if they found a buyer. Do-yoon said they'd find a buyer. Calibrated wire is needed by everyone: jewelers for chains, gunsmiths for chainmail, artifact craftsmen for windings. So Ari said she knew a merchant in Yunsan, a 3-day journey south. His name is Choi Mun-sik. He trades in copper and silver throughout the southern province. The So clan did business with him 10 years ago. She can write him a letter. Do-yoon asked if the letter would reach him. So Ari smiled, that little smile he'd seen on her face only twice. She said the letter would reach him if sent with the right person. The right person turned out to be a young watchman named Park Shung-ho, 14 years old, Grandmother Park's grandson. He arrived in Chorsan a week after they did, having walked all the way from the capital because Grandmother Park had written to him that the prince was alive and she needed help. He had walked alone for 11 days, a 14-year-old boy. Do-yoon had only just learned of this and looked at Grandma Park with an expression she couldn't quite read. She turned away and said the boy had strong legs. Do-yoon sent Sunho to Yeonsan with a letter from So-ari and 3 samples of wire of varying thicknesses. Each sample was exactly 1 chalk long. Each had a perfectly round cross-section. Do-yoon included a note with the samples specifying the exact diameter of each wire and guaranteeing that any order would be fulfilled with a tolerance of no more than 1/4 of a millimeter. So-ari included her own note with the prices. The prices were half the market rate for standard irregular wire. Do-yoon looked at her and said it was too cheap. She replied that the first batch is always cheap. It's a loss leader. Once the merchant sees the quality, he'll raise the price himself because his customers will be fighting over this product. Do-yoon looked at her again. Then he said he was lucky she'd been sent here. She replied that luck is when you're ready for an opportunity. Do-yoon recognized Seneca in that phrase and for a second forgot which world he was in. It took 10 days to build the wire drawing machine. It was more complicated than the generator. The generator could tolerate inaccuracies. The machine could not. If the clamp slipped, the wire snapped. If the hole in the board wasn't round, the wire came out oval. If the drive shaft wobbled, the wheel jerked and pulled the wire. Do-yoon remade the clamp 4 times. Hayne sat nearby and recorded every modification. On the 5th try, the clamp held. They started up the machine at dawn on the 11th day. The water wheel turned the shaft. The shaft pulled the clamp. The copper rod crept through the hole and emerged on the other side as smooth, shiny wire. Hayne measured the first meter with a vernier caliper. The deviation was 1/10 of a millimeter. She looked at Do-yoon. He looked at her. They both remained silent because they both understood what had just happened. The world's first industrial production had come into being. Not the handiwork of a master craftsman, a machine tool that produces identical parts of consistent quality. Any worker could step up to it and, after an hour of training, produce the same wire as a master with 20 years of experience. This changed everything. Foreman Kim stood behind them, watching the wire feed through the machine. He didn't understand why these two were standing there in silence with such solemn expressions. To him, it was just wire, beautiful, smooth wire. He didn't yet know that he was witnessing the end of the old world. During its first week of operation, the machine produced 800 meters of wire in 3 gauges. Soari packed it into coils of 50 meters each. Each coil was tied with twine and labeled with its diameter and length. She'd come up with this idea herself. She said that merchants love order. Order inspires trust. Trust allows you to raise the price. Do-yoon listened to her and thought that in his former world she would have become the CEO of a corporation. Here she was the wife of an exiled prince, and that was the only position this world would allow her to hold. He promised himself that this would change. Park Sung-ho returned from Yongsan 8 days later. He wasn't alone. The merchant Choi Moon-sik had come with him, a heavy-set man in his 50s on a fine horse, accompanied by 2 servants and 3 empty carts. He had come for the wire. He entered the workshop and Do-yoon showed him the machine. The merchant watched the wire feed for 3 minutes. Then he turned to Do-yoon and said he would take it all, the entire stock, and place an order for another 2,000 meters by next month. He paid in silver, real silver. Soari handled the negotiations. Do-yoon sat in the corner and watched. She bargained calmly and methodically. She conceded on the price per meter but secured an advance payment for the next order. The merchant left that same evening, taking 600 meters of wire with him and leaving a sack of silver behind. Soari weighed the silver. She counted it. She recorded it in the ledger. Then she closed the ledger and said quietly that this would be enough to feed the entire town for 2 months. Do-yoon nodded. He said that now Chorsan wasn't just surviving, Chorsan was making a profit. Grandma Park stood in the doorway and heard everything. She went to the kitchen and cooked meat for the first time in 3 months. She'd bought it from a hunter in a neighboring village for 1 copper coin. That evening, the 4 of them ate the meat together. Do-yoon, So-ari, Grandma Park, and Hye-in. Grandma Park placed the largest piece in Hye-in's bowl and said she was too thin for a young woman who would be building her future. Hye-in blushed and buried her face in her bowl. So-ari watched the scene, and something in her expression softened, just a little. But Do-yoon noticed. Silver changed Chorsan faster than electricity. People saw that work brought money, real money they could touch and spend. The day after the merchant left, 20 more people came to the governor's house and asked for work. Do-yoon hired them all. He expanded the shifts at the mine to 2, morning and afternoon. At night, the mine rested. He explained to Foreman Kim that both the rock and the people needed rest, and that 3 shifts would yield more ore in the first month but would wear out both the workers and the mine by the 3rd. Foreman Kim didn't argue. He had already grown accustomed to the governor being right about things that sounded strange. On the 4th day of the 3rd month, what Do-yoon had both expected and feared happened. A worker ran out of the mine and said they'd found something strange in the eastern tunnel. Do-yoon went down. At the end of the new passage, the workers had broken through over the past week. The wall glistened, not with copper, not with zinc, with something else. A dark metal with a bluish sheen, heavy. Do-yoon chipped off a piece and held it up to the light of his lantern. Then he held a magnet up to it. The magnet wasn't attracted. He tried scratching it with a stone. A scratch remained, but it was shallow. The metal was hard. He brought the sample to the surface and ran several tests. He heated it over a fire. The metal melted at a temperature significantly lower than iron but higher than copper. He mixed it with a piece of tin. The alloy turned out to be strong and light. Do-yoon worked on the samples until nightfall. Ha-in sat beside him and recorded the results of each test. He didn't know exactly what kind of metal it was. In his past world, he had never encountered such a combination of properties. Perhaps it was a metal that simply didn't exist in his world. A world with mana might contain elements not found in the standard periodic table. The thought was both frightening and thrilling. He gave it a working name, Blue Stone. So Ari wrote the name in the logbook and added a question mark next to it. But before he had a chance to examine the blue stone further, news arrived from the outside world. Merchant Choi Munsik had sent a messenger with a letter. The letter was long, but the gist of it could be summed up in 3 lines. The wire from Chorsan had caused a sensation in Yeonsan. Jewelers were fighting over it. Gunsmiths were too. The price had tripled in a week, and most importantly, the Bayek clan had found out. They sent a representative to the merchant and demanded to know the source of the goods. The merchant didn't say, but he wrote that he wouldn't be able to hold out for long. Clans know how to apply pressure. Do-yoon read the letter and passed it to Soari. She read it in silence. Then she looked up and said they might have a month before the Pek clan figures out where the wire's coming from. Or maybe they have already figured it out. Do-yoon nodded. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, a water wheel turned. The river flowed. Lights were on in 3 houses. 412 people lived in the town that had been dead just 3 months ago. He turned to Soari and said they needed an ally, a real one, with an army and a name. Someone the Pek clan wouldn't dare touch. Soari was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said one name. The 3rd prince. Lee Kyung-ho. The youngest of Do-yoon's 4 older brothers, the weakest in the struggle for the throne, the smartest, the only one without clan support, and for that very reason, the only one to whom they could offer a deal he couldn't refuse. Do-yoon asked what kind of deal. Soari said the 3rd prince needed money. He had no clan backing him. His troops are small and poorly armed. If you offer him a share of the wire trade in exchange for protection from the priests and the Bayek clan, he'll agree because he has no other choice. Do-yoon thought about it. Then he said it was dangerous. If the 3rd prince sees Chorsan and realizes what's going on here, he might want to take it all. So Ari replied that this was precisely why the 3rd prince must not come to Chorsan. He must receive the wire and silver, but he must not know how it's done. Do-yoon looked at her intently for a long moment. Then he said she was thinking like a spy. She replied that she was thinking like a woman who had grown up at court. It took Soari 3 days to write the letter to the 3rd prince. She rewrote it 7 times. Every word was carefully considered. She did not ask for protection. She offered a partnership. She wrote that the 5th prince had found a way to produce a commodity needed by the entire empire. She wrote that this commodity could grant the 3rd prince financial independence from the clans. She made no mention of electricity, no mention of generators, no mention of light bulbs. Only wire, only copper, only money. Do-yoon read the final draft and said the letter was perfect. So Ari nodded and sealed it. The letter was sent with Park Seong-ho. The boy set off alone once more, this time for the capital. A 12-day journey for a grown man. Grandma Park didn't sleep a wink the night after he left. Do-yoon found her at dawn, standing by the window. She said the boy was too young for such a mission. Do-yoon replied that the boy had traveled from the capital to Chorsan alone at the age of 14. He would manage. Grandma Park said she knew he would manage. She wasn't afraid for his legs, but for his heart. The capital breaks people. Do-yoon sat down next to her and remained silent. He didn't know what to say because she was right. While they waited for a reply from the capital, Do-yoon didn't sit idly by. He built. Every day. The second smelting furnace began operating on the 10th day of the third month. It was larger than the first and produced 4 ingots a day instead of 2. He expanded the wire drawing shop, and now it housed 2 machines. One drew thin wire for windings, the other drew thick wire for construction needs. Ha-in operated the thin wire machine. She had learned to sense it like a musical instrument. By the sound, she could tell when the wire was running smoothly and when it was starting to wobble. Do-yoon watched her and thought that in a year she would know more about that machine than he did. He began teaching her systematically, 2 hours every evening, mathematics, physics, the basics of electrical engineering. He didn't have any textbooks, so he wrote them himself. Notebooks he filled in the evenings by the light of a bulb. Ha-in read them during the day while the machine was running. She asked questions that sometimes made him stop mid-sentence because the answer required knowledge he hadn't yet had time to teach her. She was skipping ahead. She saw connections before he had a chance to point them out. She studied with Airy, too, not physics. She taught him something else. Every evening she asked Do-yoon about his past world, not about technology, but about trade, about how markets work, what a contract is, what a patent is, what a monopoly is, and how it differs from clan privilege. Do-yoon answered, and with each passing day he realized he was explaining things to her that she grasped on the first try. She didn't just memorize. She applied what she learned. A week later, she came to him with a document she'd drafted herself, a contract to supply wire to the merchant Choi Mun-sik with a fixed price for 3 months, with a late payment penalty for both parties, with a clause regarding the confidentiality of the source of production. Do-yoon read the contract. Then he looked at her. Then he said that in his past world, this document would be called a commercial contract and would be drafted by lawyers with 10 years of education. Ari didn't smile. She said that education was good, but life at court taught you faster. Do-yoon didn't argue. The reply from the capital arrived 26 days later. Park Sun-ho returned alive, but gaunt and silent. Grandmother Park fed him for 3 days without leaving his side. He brought 2 letters. One was from the third prince, Lee Gyong-ho. The second was unsigned. Do-yoon opened the first one. The third prince wrote in a restrained and cautious manner. He thanked his 5th brother for the proposal. He expressed interest. He asked for 10 spools of the highest quality wire to be sent as samples, and he requested a detailed description of the terms of the partnership. Not a single unnecessary word, not a single commitment. So Ari read the letter and said that the third prince was smarter than people made him out to be. He hadn't said yes or no. He was asking for proof. Do-yoon nodded. That was something he could provide. He opened the second letter. It was written on expensive paper, in small, feminine handwriting. It contained 3 lines. The first line stated that the author knew about lamps without mana. The second line stated that High Priest Hwang Gi-chul was preparing a second visit to Chorsan in 2 months, this time with the authority to perform a purification ritual. The third line stated that the author wanted to see the light herself. There was no signature, but a small seal was stamped in the corner. Ha-in, who was standing nearby, looked at the seal and turned pale. She recognized it. It was Hwang Ji-yeon's personal seal, the youngest daughter of the head of the Hwang clan. Do-yoon asked Ha-in how she recognized the seal. Ha-in replied that 3 years ago, Hwang Ji-yeon had passed through Chorsan with a detachment of guards. She had stopped for one night. She'd been drinking at a tavern and got into a fight with one of her bodyguards. She'd broken his arm without even getting up from her chair. Ha-in had seen this from the window. She remembered the seal on her waist pouch because she memorized everything she saw. Do-yoon looked at Ha-in, then at the letter, then at Soari. Soari said that Hwang Ji-yeon was known at court as the best combat mage of her generation and as the disgrace of her clan. She had turned down 3 advantageous marriage proposals. She had beaten up her own father's envoy. She had been expelled from her clan 6 months ago, and nothing had been heard of her since. Do-yoon folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. He said he would reply later. Business came first. The fact was that Chorsan was growing faster than Do-yoon had expected. In just 3 months, the population had increased by 40 people. Families from neighboring villages were coming because they'd heard there was work and food in Chorsan. 452 residents. That meant more mouths to feed, more hands to work, and more problems. The first problem was housing. Half the houses in town had caved-in roofs. Workers were living 5 to a room. Children were sleeping on the floor. Do-yun halted the mine's expansion and reassigned the workers to construction for 10 days. They repaired the roofs with shingles and tiles made from local clay. The walls were reinforced with the same cement used in the mine. In 10 days, they fixed up 12 houses, not perfect, but dry and warm. This was important because autumn was approaching, and Do-yun knew that a mountain winter would kill people more surely than any priest. The second problem was more serious: water. The river provided water for drinking and for the water wheel, but people also washed in it, and waste from the smelter was dumped into it. Do-yun saw this every day, and every day it made him cringe. He knew how this would end: dysentery, cholera, typhus. Any of these diseases could wipe out the town in a week. He began building a water supply system, a simple one: wooden pipes made from hollowed-out tree trunks. The intake was upstream from the town, where the water was clean. The pipes led to a stone reservoir in the center of town. People drew water from the reservoir for drinking and cooking. Wastewater flowed downstream. The smelter was also located downstream, separating clean and dirty water, a basic lesson in sanitary engineering. No one here had ever thought about that before. Building the water system took 3 weeks, 20 workers, 120 meters of wooden pipes, a stone reservoir set in cement mortar. When the first clean water flowed from the pipe into the reservoir, children gathered around and drank it by the handful. One woman filled a jug with water and burst into tears. She said that in her 20 years in Chorsan, she had never once drunk water that didn't smell of iron and coal. Do-yun stood nearby, silent. He thought about how, in his former world, clean water had been such a commonplace thing that people would pour it out without finishing it. While the water pipeline was being built, Do-yun worked on another project at the same time. He was preparing a gift for the third prince, not wire. Wire is a commodity. He needed a gift that would show the third prince that Chorsan was not just a mining town with good copper. He worked for 4 nights. He made a small electric lantern. It was the size of a palm. The wooden casing was lined with copper sheet. Inside were 3 zinc and copper cells connected in series, a small light bulb with a carbon filament, a button made of a copper plate. Press it and the light comes on. Release it and it goes out. The cells provided enough power for 4 hours of continuous light. It couldn't be recharged, but that wasn't necessary. It was just a demonstration. Do-yun packed the lantern into a wooden box lined with silk. So Ari placed a letter next to it, a short one. The 5th prince, Lee Do-hyun, presents to the 3rd prince Lee Kyung-ho an object that no one else in the empire possesses: light that requires no mana. Light that anyone, regardless of social status, can carry in their pocket. So Ari wrote this last sentence and underlined it. She said the 3rd prince would understand. He is the only one of the 4 brothers who seeks support among the common people rather than among the clans. Light for anyone, regardless of social status. These are the words he wants to hear. The lantern was sent with Park Seung-ho. This time, Grandma Park didn't let him go alone. She sent a hunter from a neighboring village with him, a burly man with a bow and a knife. The boy protested, but Grandma Park gave him that look that silenced even grown men, and Seung-ho fell silent and left with the hunter without arguing. While waiting for an answer, Do-yun returned to the blue stone. He conducted a series of experiments. He heated it, he melted it, he mixed it with copper, he mixed it with iron, he mixed it with tin. The results puzzled him. The blue stone behaved unlike any metal from his past world. When alloyed with copper, it doubled the conductivity. A wire made of the blue stone and copper alloy conducted electricity better than pure copper. This was impossible according to the laws of physics he knew, but the calipers and the tests didn't lie. He sat poring over the results and thought, Hein sat beside him and looked at his face. She asked what was wrong. He said that everything was wrong. This metal shouldn't exist, but it does. Hein thought for a moment and said that maybe the laws in this world were a little different. Do-yoon looked at her. A 17-year-old girl from a mining town had just told him what he'd been afraid to say himself. Maybe the laws of physics in a world with mana aren't quite the same as in a world without mana. Maybe mana isn't just a field, but a fundamental force that alters the properties of matter. If that's the case, then all of his engineering rests on a foundation he doesn't fully understand. It was dangerous, and it was thrilling. He decided to test it. He picked up a piece of blue stone and held it up to the running generator. Nothing happened. Then he wrapped the blue stone in copper wire and connected it to the generator. The stone heated up intensely. Do-yoon pulled his hand away. The stone had become red hot and began to glow, not with an orange light like coal. Blue. A cold blue light. Ha-in took a step back. So Ari, who was watching from the doorway, did the same. Do-yoon stared at the glowing stone. A picture was forming in his mind. The blue stone interacted with electricity differently than ordinary metal. It resonated, it amplified. It was something between a conductor and an artifact, and if he was right, this stone could be the key to everything, to the jamming towers, to the amplifiers, to things he hadn't even thought of yet. He extinguished the stone by turning off the power. Then he sat down on the floor and closed his eyes. Hein asked if he was all right. He said yes, he was just trying not to scream with joy. Fall came early to Chorsan. By the 4th month, the mountains were covered in yellow and red. The nights had grown cold. In the mornings, frost lay on the rooftops, and the workers' breath steamed at the mine entrance. Do-yoon stood by the window and counted. Winter in the mountains begins in November. He had 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, he had to do 3 things. First, stock up on enough coal to heat all the houses. Second, insulate the houses that couldn't withstand the mountain frost. Third, build up a 4-month supply of food. The fish in the river were retreating to deeper waters as the cold set in. The miners had stopped working. He called So Ari and Foreman Kim to a morning meeting. So Ari arrived with a logbook containing precise figures, grain reserves for a month and a half, dried fish for a month. There was enough silver to buy another 3 months' worth of food in Yonsan, but the journey in winter would take not 3 days, but a week or more. Do-yoon listened and sketched. He was sketching a stove, not the ordinary stone hearth found in every home, but a different kind, a stove with a flue system that heated the floor. He knew that in the Korea of his past world, this was called an ondol and had existed for thousands of years. Here in Haesong, houses were heated with braziers and magical heat stones that burned out within a season and cost so much that the peasants couldn't afford them. Bimo. Do-yoon drew a diagram. The firebox was outside the house. Hot smoke traveled under the floor through stone channels. It warmed the floor and exited through a chimney. The heat is distributed evenly. You can burn coal or firewood. No mana required. Foreman Kim looked at the diagram and said nothing. Then he said that his mother had frozen to death 12 years ago because the heat stone in their house had burned out in January and they didn't have a new one. Do-yoon looked at him. Then he said that this winter no one in Chorsan would freeze to death. Foreman Kim nodded and left. An hour later, he brought back 30 volunteers. It took 4 weeks to build the heating system. It was the largest construction project in the history of Chorsan. Every house received a stove and a system of underfloor ducts. The work was hard. They had to tear up the old floors, lay out the stone ducts with cement mortar, install the chimneys, set up the fireboxes, rebuild the floors. 30 houses, 30 stoves. Do-yoon worked alongside everyone else. His hands were covered in calluses and scrapes. Every evening, Grandma Park would rub them with herbal ointment and grumble that a governor shouldn't be laying stones like a mason. Do-yoon would reply that a governor should do whatever needs to be done. She would grumble and keep rubbing. Meanwhile, Ha-in was busy with something else. Do-yoon had entrusted her with a project he'd told no one about except her and So Ari. A jamming tower, not a full-fledged one. A prototype. Small, just big enough for one room. He explained the principle to Haeon. When an electric current passes through it, the blue stone creates a field that disrupts mana. He didn't yet know exactly how or why, but he knew it worked because he'd seen it with his own eyes. The stone glowed blue. That glow wasn't just light, it was doing something to the space around it. Do-yoon could feel it on his skin, like a slight tingling. Hyun couldn't feel it, neither could Ari. He wondered if perhaps Prince Do-hyun's damaged magical channels gave him a sensitivity to this field that ordinary people lacked. He instructed Hyun to make a small coil out of an alloy of the blue stone and copper. 10 turns. Connect it to the generator via a switch. When the current flows, record everything that happens. Ha-in worked for 3 days. She wound the coil. She mounted it on a wooden stand in the corner of the workshop. She connected the wires. Do-yoon stood nearby. So Ari stood in the doorway with a notebook. Hae-in turned on the power. The coil hummed. A low, steady hum. The blue stone in the winding glowed with a dim blue light. Do-yoon felt a tingling in his hands, stronger than last time. He took a step back, so Ari didn't feel anything. Neither did Hae-in. But the candle on the table went out, not because the wind blew it out. It went out because the wick suddenly stopped burning. So Ari looked at the candle, then at the coil. Then at Do-yoon. He told her to relight the candle. She took the flint, struck a spark. The wick lit up normally. Do-yoon told Hae-in to turn off the coil. She turned it off. The candle burned steadily. He told her to turn it on again. Yeon turned it on. The candle went out. Silence. Do-yoon looked at the extinguished candle and thought. The coil hadn't put out the flame. The flint worked fine. So it wasn't suppressing the combustion. It was suppressing something else, something that was in this candle and wasn't in the spark from the flint. He picked up the candle and examined it. An ordinary tallow candle, but on the wick was a tiny symbol burned into the wax. An artifact mark. This candle was an artifact. It burned not with fire, but with mana, just like all the candles sold by the Peck clan. Do-yoon smiled slowly. The blue stone coil wasn't extinguishing the fire. It was extinguishing the mana. Within the radius of this room, not a single magical artifact was functioning. He turned to Hae-in and So Ari. He said they had just invented a weapon. So Ari closed her journal. She asked quietly if he understood what would happen when people found out. Do-yoon said he understood. It meant the clans would no longer be able to control people through their monopoly on light, heat, and communication. It meant the priests would no longer be able to threaten people with burning, because their own magic didn't work within the tower's range. It meant war. So Ari nodded. She said that in that case they would need this ally very soon. Do-yoon agreed. The reply from the third prince arrived a week later. This time, it wasn't a letter. The third prince, Lee Kyung-ho, sent his trusted representative, a middle-aged man in plain clothes. He introduced himself as Secretary Yoon Chang-soo. He arrived alone on horseback. He was polite and attentive. He didn't take any notes, but Do-yoon could see that he was memorizing every word. Yoon Chang-soo said that the third prince had received the lantern. The third prince had stayed awake all night. He kept pressing the button and staring at the light. In the morning, he summoned Yoon Chang-soo and said one sentence. "I want to know how." Yoon Chang-soo had come to find out how. Do-yoon looked at So Ari. She nodded almost imperceptibly. He led Yoon Chang-soo to the generator. He showed him the water wheel. He showed him the coil. He showed him the wires. He showed him the light bulb. He didn't show him the blue stone or the jamming tower. Yoon Chang-soo watched it all in silence. When Do-yoon finished, the secretary stood motionless for a full minute. Then he said that this would change the world. Do-yoon replied that it would. That was exactly why he needed someone to protect it until it grew strong enough to protect itself. Yoon Chang-soo nodded. He left the next morning. So Ari stood on the porch and watched him leave. She said that in a month they would know whether the third prince would be their shield or their gravedigger. Do-yoon said they had no choice anyway. She replied that there's always a choice. It's just that sometimes all the options are bad. He looked at her and thought that in another life he would simply like to drink tea with her and not worry about anything. But this wasn't that life. The first snow fell the next day, light and wet. It settled on the roofs of Chorsan and melted by noon. But Do-yoon saw it as a warning. Winter was coming. He checked all 30 stoves himself. 28 were working. 2 needed their chimneys repaired. He fixed them in a day. In the evening, he walked through the city. Smoke rose from every house. Every house was warm. Light bulbs were now burning in 12 houses. The water supply was working. There was a 2.5-month supply of food, enough silver for another 2 months. The mine was producing copper. The machines were producing wire. He stood in the middle of the main street and looked at his town. 452 people. Not a single one had died in 4 months. He didn't pray because he didn't know whom to pray to. But if he had prayed, he would have asked for one thing: time. Just a little more time. Winter struck at the beginning of the 5th month. Not gently. The mountains were buried in snow overnight. By morning, the road to the valley had vanished beneath a white blanket 1/2 meter thick. The river hadn't frozen over, just as Do-yoon had predicted. Hot springs kept the water warm, and the water wheel kept turning even as the banks froze over. The generator was running, the lights were on, the stoves were burning. Chorsan was alive. Do-yoon stood on the porch of the governor's house, wrapped in a blanket instead of a cloak, drinking a hot brew that Grandma Park had made from dried berries. He looked at the smoking chimneys and thought that no one would die of the cold this winter. That was the most important thing. Everything else came second. But winter brought its own problems. On the 3rd day of the freeze, one of the wooden water pipes burst. The water had frozen inside, and the ice had split the walls. Do-yoon cursed himself quietly and methodically. He knew that water expands when it freezes. He knew that wooden pipes wouldn't hold up. He should have wrapped them in insulation before the frost set in. He didn't have time. Too much to do. Too little time. He repaired the pipe in a day by wrapping it in several layers of straw and burlap. Then he went along the entire water line and wrapped every exposed section. Hyein helped. She worked silently and quickly. Her hands were red from the cold, but she didn't complain. When they finished, she looked at her hands and said she needed gloves. Do-yoon said he'd make her some gloves. She said she'd sew them herself. All she needed was fabric. He gave her a piece of woolen cloth from their supplies. She sewed the gloves that evening. They were uneven and rough, but warm. She sewed 3 pairs, one for herself, one for Do-yoon, and one for Grandma Park. Do-yoon put on the gloves and looked at her. She turned away and went to the sewing machine. On the 10th day of winter, an event occurred that changed the balance of power around Chorsan. A lone rider approached the city, a woman. She wore a worn traveling cloak with a sword strapped to her back. She dismounted at the gate and asked the sentry where the governor's house was. The sentry glanced at the sword and sent a boy to fetch Foreman Kim. The foreman arrived 5 minutes later. The woman introduced herself as Hwang Ji-yeon. The foreman turned pale. He remembered her. He remembered the guard's broken arm. He escorted her to Do-yoon. Do-yoon was sitting in the workshop, working on the 2nd coil made of blue stone. When Hwang Ji-yeon entered, he looked up and saw a tall woman of about 24 with short-cropped hair and a scar across her left eyebrow. Her clothes were dirty and torn. Her boots were worn through. She was thin, not from illness, but from the journey. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. Then her gaze shifted behind him, to the generator, to the wires, to the blue stone coil humming quietly on the workbench, at the light bulb that glowed with a steady, warm light. She stared at the light bulb for a long time. Then she turned to him and said that she'd been told the 5th prince had gone mad and was playing with copper coins in the mountains. She'd come to check. She said he hadn't gone mad. He had done something far worse. He had become dangerous. Do-yoon stood up and offered her a seat. She sat down. Grandma Park brought her some tea and a bowl of hot porridge. Huang Jiyan ate greedily and without restraint. She ate 3 servings. Grandma Park fed her silently and approvingly. When Jiyan finished eating, she wiped her mouth on her sleeve and said she had come to ask for a job. She said she'd been told that here, no one asks whose daughter you are. She wanted to see if that was true. Duyun asked why she had left the clan. She replied briefly, "Because the Huang clan is a kennel, and I'm not a dog." Duyun asked what she was capable of. She said she knew 17 ways to kill people and 2 ways to make rice cakes. Duyun didn't smile, even though he wanted to. He asked if she knew how to command people. She said she had commanded a squad of 20 fighters on the northern border for 2 years. Everyone survived. He asked what she knew about mana. She looked at him intently. Then she said she knew more than she would have liked. She said that her uncle was the high priest Huang Yi Chol, that she had grown up in the temple of the bright path and had witnessed rituals that ordinary people aren't shown, that she knew mana wasn't the breath of heaven but something else, something older and less benevolent than the priest's claim. Duyun listened without interrupting. When she fell silent, he asked why she had written him that warning letter. She replied that she hadn't done it for his sake. She'd done it to spite her uncle. Then she paused and added that maybe it was a little for his sake too, because a person who kindles a light without mana is either a madman or a beacon of hope, and she was tired of living without hope. Doyun made his decision in a minute. Soari was against it. She took Doyun aside and said that Huang Ji-yeon might be a spy, the daughter of the Huang clan, the niece of the high priest. It's too convenient, too timely. Doyun listened to her. Then he said that Soari was right. It could be a trap, but Chorsan needed a fighter, not a laborer or a merchant. A fighter, someone who could stand between the priests and the people when they came again. And they would come. Soari pressed her lips together. Then she said she would keep a personal watch on Ji-yeon every day, every hour. Doyun nodded. He returned to Ji-yeon and told her she was accepted. She would be responsible for Chorsan's security, 20 people under her command. She would choose them herself. Weapons. Doyun hesitated. The weapons would be non-standard. He asked her to wait. Then he went out to the workshop and returned with an object he'd made a week ago and hadn't shown to anyone, a long copper tube mounted on a wooden base. At the end of the tube were 2 contacts. Inside was a coil made of a blue stone alloy. A wire led to a small battery mounted on the base. There was a button on the handle. Doyun pressed the button. The coil hummed. The end of the tube glowed with a dim blue light. He pointed the tube at a magic candle standing on the table 3 steps away from him. The candle went out. He released the button. The coil fell silent. He lit the candle with a flint. It lit normally. He pressed the button again and aimed the tube. The candle went out. Huang Ji-yeon watched this. She said nothing. Her face was expressionless. Then she reached out her hand and said she wanted to try. Doyun handed her the tube. She pressed the button. She aimed it at the candle. The candle went out. Ji-yeon lowered the tube. Then she looked at her hands, hands that, for 20 years, had known nothing but swords and mana. She said quietly, "If we point this thing at a mage, what will happen?" Doyun replied that the mage would lose access to mana for the duration of the field. He wouldn't be able to cast spells. He wouldn't be able to levitate. He wouldn't be able to cast shields. He would become an ordinary person. Ji-yeon looked at the tube in her hands. Then she looked up at Doyun. She said that this wasn't a weapon. It was a revolution. Doyun replied that a revolution is when every peasant can make one just like this. We're a long way from that. For now, it's just a tube. Ji-yeon nodded. She pressed the tube to her chest and said she would protect Chorsan, not because she was ordered to, but because for the first time in 24 years she had seen something worth standing up for. That evening, 6 people sat at the table in the governor's house: Doyun, Soari, Ha-in, Grandma Park, Foreman Kim, and Huang Ji-yeon. Grandma Park poured everyone a cup of hot herbal tea. Ji-yeon sipped her tea and looked around the room. A light bulb glowed on the table, blueprints on the walls, a stack of Soari's journals in the corner. Han's notebooks filled with formulas, a map of Chorsan with annotations. She said that in the Huang clan's house, which occupied an entire block of the capital, she felt less at home than she did in this room with a copper basin on the wall and the smell of fish wafting from the kitchen. Grandma Park looked at her and said that if Ji-yeon wanted to feel at home, she should wash her hands before eating, because that was the rule in this house. Ji-yeon looked at Grandma Park. Then she stood up, walked over to the water barrel, and washed her hands with the soap that Do-yoon had boiled in a cauldron in the backyard. She washed them thoroughly. Then she returned and showed Grandma Park her clean palms. Grandma Park nodded and placed an extra piece of fish in her bowl. Hae-in snorted, so Ari hid a smile behind her bowl. Do-yoon looked at all of them, at his people, at his team. 5 women and 1 minor, against the empire of clans and the army of priests. He thought their chances were slim. Then he thought that odds were just numbers, and numbers could be changed. He finished his broth and went to the workshop to sketch out his next project, a steam engine. Because winter was long and it would be good to have a backup for the water wheel. Winter dragged on and Do-young made the most of every day. A steam engine. He built it from whatever materials he had on hand. A copper boiler, hand-riveted. An iron piston, turned on a primitive lathe he'd assembled from an oak frame and a hand crank. A cylinder made from a cast-iron pipe cast in a smelter. A connecting rod, a flywheel. Every part required dozens of attempts. The first piston seized after 3 strokes. The second held steam for a minute, and then the oiled leather gasket burst and scalded a worker's hand. Do-yoon bandaged it himself. Yoon So-mi, whom he did not yet know at the time, was not in Chorsan, so the midwife Moon Yeon-hee treated the wound with soap and a clean cloth. The hand healed without infection. The soap worked. The third piston worked as it should. Do-yoon started the machine at the end of the 6th month. It was ugly. It shook. Steam whistled from every joint, but it turned the shaft. And to that shaft, Do-yoon connected a second generator. Now Chorsan had 2 sources of electricity, water and steam. If the river runs dry, and it won't, but if it does, the steam engine will take over the load. Hae-in stood nearby and listened to the machine puffing away. She said that this thing breathes like a living being. Do-yoon said it wasn't alive. It's obedient. That's better. A living thing might fail. An obedient one does exactly what you've calculated. Hae-in thought for a moment and said that in that case the generator was obedient and the water wheel was obedient too, and that all of his science was a way to make things obedient. Do-yoon looked at her and said that she had just given the best definition of engineering he'd ever heard. The middle of winter brought an unexpected guest, not an enemy. A small, quiet woman in a gray coat with a medical bag slung over her shoulder. Yoon So-mi, 20 years old, a healer from a younger branch of the Yoon clan. She had come on foot, through the snow, 4 days' walk from the nearest town. She came because she'd heard that in Chorsan the governor washed his hands before touching a patient. She came because the Yoon clan had ordered her to treat only aristocrats, but she'd treated a peasant child for a fever, and for that she'd been beaten and expelled. She stood on the threshold of the governor's house with chapped lips and frostbitten fingers, begging to be allowed to stay. Do-yoon let her in. Grandmother Park undressed her, laid her down by the stove, and rubbed her feet with warm oil for 3 hours. Ji-yeon brought her own blanket and covered So-mi with it, on top of her own. So Ari brought hot porridge. Ha-in dragged a copper coil heating element, which Do-yoon had made last week, from the workshop and placed it next to the bed. So-mi lay there in the warmth, crying, not from pain, but because 5 women she didn't know, and 1 man she didn't know had welcomed her as if they'd been waiting for her their whole lives. Do-yoon sat in the corner, saying nothing. He waited for her to warm up. Then he sat down beside her and asked what she knew about treating infected wounds. She looked up at him with eyes red from crying and began to speak. She spoke for 2 hours. She knew herbs that stop decay. She knew decoctions that reduce fever. She knew techniques that helped bones heal faster, all through mana, all through magical channels. Do-yoon listened and asked questions. Then he told her about invisible beings, about soap, about boiling water, about how clean hands save more lives than any spell. Somi listened, holding her breath. Then she asked quietly how many people she had killed over 10 years of practice, simply because she didn't know she was supposed to wash her hands. Do-yoon didn't answer. He placed a notebook in front of her and said that from now on they would study together. She would take his teachings, he would take her knowledge of herbs. Together they would create medicine that works without mana and better than with mana. Somi took the notebook. Her hands were still trembling, but her eyes were no longer filled with tears. Spring came to Chorsan in the 8th month. The snow melted in 2 weeks. The river swelled with meltwater, and the water wheel spun faster than ever. The generator produced more electricity. The light bulbs shone brighter. Do-yoon connected 10 more houses to the grid. Now 22 out of 30 houses had electric light. The population of Chorsan had grown to 530 people. Not a single person had died over the winter. Not from the cold, not from hunger, not from illness. Somi kept records of every patient. Over the 3 winter months, 42 visits, burns, cuts, colds, 1 fracture, not a single infection, not a single death. She showed these records to Do-yoon. He read them and said it was the best report he'd ever seen in his life. She didn't realize he was referring to both of his lives. Spring brought a reply from the 3rd prince as well. Yoon Chang-soo returned with a document, an official one, bearing the 3rd prince's seal, a treaty of trade patronage. The 3rd prince, Lee Kyung-ho, takes Chorsan under his protection in exchange for 20% of the wire trade and the exclusive right to sell Chorsan goods in the capital. So Ari read the treaty 3 times. She found 2 clauses that needed to be changed. One gave the 3rd prince the right to inspect production. She crossed it out. The second did not specify the treaty's term. She wrote in 3 years. Do-yoon asked why 3. She said that in 3 years, Chorsan would no longer need patronage. Do-yoon looked at her. She said this without bravado, as a fact, like the numbers in her journal. Yoon Chang-soo took the revised contract back. 2 weeks later, he returned with a signed copy. The 3rd prince had accepted all the amendments. So Ari said that this meant one thing. The 3rd prince was both intelligent and desperate. An intelligent person wouldn't have accepted it right away. A desperate person would have accepted it without any amendments. He accepted it with the amendments and quickly. That meant he was both intelligent and desperate at the same time. He was the best ally one could hope for and the most dangerous. The 9th month became the month of school. Do-yoon had put it off for far too long. 64 children lived in Chorsan. Not a single one of them knew how to read. Not a single one could count past 100. Not a single one knew that the earth was round. He set aside the 2nd floor of the governor's house for the school, 4 rooms. He knocked together desks from planks. Hyen carved slates from the slate that was abundant in the mine dumps. So Ari wrote the primer. By hand, 40 pages. She wrote it at night by the light of a bulb in her calligraphic handwriting and drew a picture next to each letter. The letter M with a copper coin drawn next to it. The letter R with a fish drawn next to it. Do-yoon saw the primer and silently put it back on the table. Then he turned toward the wall. So Ari asked what was wrong. He said everything was fine. He said he just needed a second. She didn't understand. He didn't explain that in his past world, a primer like this would have taken a team of 10 people a year to complete, yet she had made it all by herself in 6 nights. The school opened on the 3rd day of the 10th month. 38 children showed up. The parents of the rest wouldn't let them come. Do-yoon didn't press the issue. He knew that coercion kills the desire to learn. He waited. A week later, 12 more arrived. The children told their families that the school was warm and bright and that a strange governor performed magic tricks with copper wire and water. A month later, all 64 children were attending school. Ha-in and So-ari taught the classes. Ha-in taught arithmetic and the basics of mechanics. She explained to the children how a lever works using a pickaxe and a stone as examples. Soari taught reading and writing. Somi taught hygiene. She taught the children to wash their hands and explained why. A boy of about 10 asked if it was true that invisible creatures lived in the dirt. Somi said it was true. The boy asked if anyone had ever seen them. Somi looked at Do-yoon, who was standing in the doorway. Do-yoon stepped forward and said that people had seen them. In his former world, people had made glass that magnified small things hundreds of times, and through that glass, every one of these creatures could be seen. The boy asked if the governor could make such glass. Do-yoon thought for a moment. Then he said he would try. That was the moment when the idea of a microscope made its way onto his list of projects. The 10th month. Almost a year had passed. Do-yoon sat in his workshop and did the math. The population of Chorsan was now 602. Families had been arriving from distant villages. Rumors were spreading. A city where people are paid for their work. A city where there is light without manna. A city where children can study for free. A city where people don't die in the winter. Every new family meant more hands and more mouths to feed. Do-yoon balanced growth and resources like a tightrope walker. The mine was producing copper steadily. 2 mine shafts were operating at full capacity. A third was being cleared. The smelter produced 8 ingots a day. The drawing machines ran in 2 shifts. The merchant Chomun-sik came every month and took away everything they produced. Soe raised the price twice. The merchant paid without haggling because his customers paid him 3 times as much. Silver flowed into Chorsan. Do-yoon spent it on food and supplies. He didn't save. Every coin worked. Every coin turned into a tool, a supply, or an improvement. Ji-yeon trained her squad, 20 men, former miners and hunters. She put them through their paces from dawn until noon, running, drills, hand-to-hand combat. After lunch, Do-yoon taught them how to use the silencers. 10 portable devices were ready by then, tubes made of copper and blue stone, powered by batteries. Each fighter learned how to turn them on and off. They learned how to aim at a target. They learned how to change the battery in the dark by touch. Ji-yeon came up with an exercise. She placed a magic candle 20 paces away, and the fighter had to extinguish it with a silencer within 3 seconds. After a month, all 20 could do it in 2 seconds. Ji-yeon reported to Do-yoon that the squad was ready. He asked what they were ready for. She replied that they were ready for whatever was coming. He asked what was coming. She looked at him seriously and said that her uncle was coming. And he came in the 11th month, not alone. With him were 50 priests and 100 warriors of the Hwan clan. They were walking along a mountain road, and the snow was melting beneath their feet because the priests were warming the air around them with manna. A sentry spotted them half a day's journey away. The boy ran up to Do-yoon and, gasping for breath, said that an army was approaching from the south. Do-yoon didn't run. He stood up from the table. He smoothed out his shirt. He stepped out onto the porch. He looked up at the sky, a gray winter sky. Then he turned and gave his orders. Calmly. Point by point. First, Ji-yeon assembles the unit and moves it into position at the entrance to the valley. Second, Haein turns all 3 jamming coils up to full power. Third, Soari gathers all the documents and logs and takes them to the mine. If the city is burned, knowledge must survive. Fourth, Grandma Park will lead the children and the elderly into the mine. Fifth, Foreman Kim will station workers with pickaxes and crowbars along the main street, not for combat, so that the priests can see the city isn't empty. So Ari asked what he himself would do. Do-yoon said he would go out to meet them. He stepped out alone, unarmed, without a silencer, wearing a work jacket and boots. He stood at the entrance to the valley when the procession of priests came around the bend. Leading the way was Hwan Gi-chol, the high priest, a tall, gaunt old man with a white beard and eyes that burned with fanatical fervor. Behind him were 50 priests in white robes, carrying staffs from which mana oozed, 100 warriors in the armor of the Huan clan. They stopped 10 paces away from Do-yun. Gichol looked down at him, then he said he had come to carry out the will of heaven, to purge Chorsan of the dead fire and heresy. Do-yun stood in silence. Gichol said the prince had a choice: surrender all the devices and repent, or burn along with them. Do-yun remained silent for another 3 seconds. Then he said one word: no. Gichol raised his hand. Mana flowed from his palm, a warm, golden wave. It was supposed to strike Do-yun in the chest and knock him back 10 paces. It traveled 2 paces and vanished. It simply vanished, like a candle in the wind. Gichol froze. He raised his hand again. He struck harder. The mana flared brighter and then faded again. Before it reached Do-yun. Behind Do-yun, on the roof of the governor's house, a blue stone coil hummed quietly. Ha-in sat next to the circuit breaker, her eyes fixed on the valley. 3 generators were running at full power, 2 water-powered and 1 steam-powered. All the energy was feeding into the coils. The suppression radius was 300 meters. Within that radius, mana did not exist. Gichol stood with his hand raised, but nothing happened. For the first time in 40 years, his mana wouldn't obey him. He tried a 3rd time, a 4th. A golden light flashed at his palm and immediately faded. The priests behind him tried their staffs. The staffs remained silent. The warriors of the Huan clan reached for their swords, but the swords were mere iron, without any magical enhancement, and the warriors could sense it. They were accustomed to battle where their armor was reinforced with mana, and their blades could cut through stone. Without mana, they were ordinary men in heavy armor on a mountain trail. Do-yun stood before them and waited. He did not rush them. He gave Gichol time to understand. The old priest understood. He slowly lowered his hand. His expression changed. The fanatical light in his eyes faded, replaced by something else: fear. The genuine, deep fear of a man who had just glimpsed a world in which he was powerless. Do-yun spoke. He spoke softly. He said he did not want war. He said that none of the priests would come to harm if they turned around and left. He said that Chorsan posed no threat to the bright path. He said that the light from the wires and the light from mana could coexist. He said he needed only one city, one small city in the mountains where people could live and not die in the winter. Gichol listened. Then he said that Do-yun didn't understand, that 1,000 years ago the same light had already burned, and the world had burned along with it. Do-yun replied that he knew. He said he'd seen the traces. He'd found an ancient artifact beneath the temple. He knows that mana isn't a blessing, but the aftermath of a catastrophe. Gichol shuddered. He hadn't expected the boy to know. He asked where he'd learned it. Do-yun said it didn't matter. Something else was important. Those people 1,000 years ago had no safeguards. He does. He knows how to control the energy. He knows how to limit its power. He knows how to avoid repeating the mistake. Gichol was silent for a long time. Then he said he didn't believe it, that everyone who gains power says they'll be careful, and then the world goes up in flames. Do-yun replied that the world goes up in flames when power is concentrated in the hands of a single person. He has no intention of keeping that power to himself. He intends to distribute it to everyone, to every peasant, every child, and every old woman who wants to embroider in the evenings. When everyone has power, there's no one left to set the world ablaze, because the world is everything. Gichol stood and listened, his face torn between 40 years of faith and 3 minutes of truth. Then Huang Ji-yon emerged from behind him. She was coming from the squad's positions, without a sword, without a silencer. She approached her uncle and stood between him and Do-yun. She said she had been serving this man for 5 months, that he had never once ordered a killing, never once ordered a burning, never once raised a hand against a person. She said that in the Huang clan in 5 months she had seen more blood than she had here in all that time. She said that if her uncle wanted to burn Chorsan, he should start with her, because she wasn't leaving. Gicho looked at his niece, at the girl he remembered as a little child, who used to sit on his lap and listen to stories about the heavenly flame, who had grown up to be a warrior and left the clan because she didn't want to be a dog. He looked at her and said nothing. Then he turned around and walked back down the path. The priests parted before him. The warriors did too. The column turned back, slowly, silently, without a single word. Gicho didn't look back even once, but at the bend in the trail he stopped. He stood with his back to Chorsan. Then, without turning around, he said that next time it wouldn't be him who came. Those who won't speak will come. Then he left. Ji-yeon stood on the road and watched him go. Her hands were trembling. Da-yoon walked up to her and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They just stood there watching the column disappear around the bend. Then Ji-yeon said he was right. Talking is better than killing. But next time, talking won't help. Do-yoon nodded and said that by next time he'd be ready. The next time came sooner than he expected. Not the priests. Worse, in the 13th month, the merchant Choi Moon-sik sent a messenger with an alarming letter. Second Prince Lee Min-ho is assembling a punitive force, 8,000 men, 40 battle mages, 3 high-ranking archons. The target, Chorsan, the official pretext, the governor's rebellion. The real reason, the Baek and Hwang clans had joined forces and paid the second prince to destroy Chorsan. They realized that the wire was only the beginning. They realized that light without mana meant the end of their monopoly, and they decided to crush it while it was still small. Do-yoon read the letter. Then he read it aloud to all 6 of them. Grandma Park, So-ari, Ha-in, Yi-yeon, Foreman Kim, and So-mi. Silence lasted 20 seconds. Then So-ari spoke up. She said they had 3 months. The army wouldn't march in winter. In the spring, the roads would be muddy. Realistically, the punitive force would reach Chorsan by summer. 4 months. Do-yoon nodded. He stood up and walked over to the map on the wall. He looked at the valley, a narrow entrance from the south. Mountains to the east and west, a river to the north, a single road. He turned and said that 4 months would be enough. 4 months. Do-yoon broke them down into stages. The first month, 12 mana suppression towers around the perimeter of the valley. Each tower consists of a stone base, a wooden mast, and a coil of blue stone alloy at the top. Wires run to a central station by the river, where 3 generators supply power. Each tower has a radius of 300 meters. Together they cover the entire valley and its approaches with a continuous field of mana suppression. Hain calculated the layout. She drew a map with coverage circles and found 3 dead zones. She moved the towers around on paper until the zones disappeared. Do-yoon checked her calculations. He adjusted 1 tower by 20 meters to the west. The rest was perfect. He told her so. She nodded and went to oversee the construction. Phase 2. Weapons. Do-yoon didn't want to kill anyone. He told this to Ji-yeon, and she listened with the expression of someone who wanted to agree but couldn't. She said that 8,000 soldiers wouldn't be stopped just because their magic didn't work. They had swords, bows, and siege engines. The jammers would neutralize the magic, but they wouldn't neutralize the iron. Do-yoon knew she was right. He sat in the workshop for 3 nights. Then he began working on what he'd been putting off since day 1, rifled barrels. Not gunpowder? He didn't want gunpowder. Gunpowder is a weapon of mass destruction, and he knew where that would lead. Instead, he built a pneumatic weapon. Compressed air from the steam engine flowed through copper pipes to the shooter's positions. A valve, a rifled barrel, a lead bullet, a range of 200 paces, accuracy sufficient to hit a shield, not a person. He ordered them to aim at shields and armor, not at people. The bullet pierced a standard shield right through. A soldier without a shield or magic in an open space is a soldier who wants to surrender. Ji-yeon looked at the air rifle and said she would call it a merciful weapon. Do-yoon said there's no such thing as a merciful weapon. There are weapons that give the enemy a chance to survive. She gave him a long look. Then she said he was a strange man. He replied that he was an engineer. It's pretty much the same thing. Stage 3. Communications. Field telegraph. Wires ran from each tower to the command post. Each tower had a key. An operator could send a signal. 3 short pulses meant attack from my direction. 3 long pulses meant I need help. 1 long pulse followed by 1 short pulse meant all clear. Do-yoon trained the operators in a week. Hae-in checked every line personally. Together with Ari, she compiled a code table and distributed copies to all the commanders. Stage 4. The people. Chorsan now had a population of 650. Of those, 120 were capable of handling weapons. Ji-yeon selected the 60 best. 40 marksmen armed with air rifles, 20 jammer operators. She assigned the rest to the reserve, equipped with spears and shields. Do-yoon gathered everyone in the town center. He didn't give a speech, he stated the facts. The army is coming. 8,000. They want to destroy Chorsan, not because Chorsan threatens them, but because Chorsan proves that it's possible to live without clans. He said he wasn't forcing anyone to fight. Anyone who wanted to leave could leave. He wouldn't judge them. No one left. The second prince's army arrived at the beginning of summer, just as Ari had predicted. They filled the southern road from the horizon to the bend. Infantry, cavalry. Siege towers levitating by magic, 40 mages in gleaming armor, 3 archons in black cloaks with gold embroidery. The second prince, Lee Min-ho, rode at the head on a white horse. A handsome young man of 26 who had never lost a battle in his life because he always fought those weaker than himself. Do-yoon stood in the command post on the roof of the governor's house. A map lay before him. A telegraph key stood nearby. Ari stood behind his shoulder with a logbook. Hae-in sat at the main circuit breaker. Ji-yeon was downstairs with the squad at the entrance to the valley. The army entered the valley. The levitating siege towers wavered. They tilted. They crashed to the ground with a roar that could be heard in the mine. The magic failed. The jammers were working. 40 mages simultaneously reached out for mana and found none. The archons stopped. Their expressions changed. They were accustomed to sensing mana as naturally as air. And suddenly, the air had vanished. One of the archons screamed, not from pain, but from horror. The cavalry fell into disarray. The mages' horses, accustomed to the flow of mana through their harnesses, suddenly became ordinary horses and panicked at the roar and the screams. The formation broke. Do-yoon pressed the telegraph key. 3 short signals were sent to all the towers. The gunners opened fire. The pneumatic rifles clicked dryly and sharply. The bullets struck the shields, into the armor, into the ground in front of the front line. Not at the men. The shields shattered like clay pots. Armor without magical reinforcement buckled under the impact. Soldiers fell not from wounds, but from fear. They didn't understand what was happening. Their shields were breaking. Their magic was dead. Their towers lay on the ground. And from the city came something invisible and unstoppable. The second prince shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Ji-yeon stepped forward, alone, without a sword, holding a copper megaphone in her hands. She shouted that Chorsan was offering a truce. Lay down your weapons, and no one will be harmed. Continue, and we will continue. 30 seconds of silence. Then the first soldier dropped his sword, followed by a second, a third, a 10th, a 100th. This went on for 12 minutes. 12 minutes later, the second prince's army stood unarmed in the Chorsan Valley, staring at the 60 archers on the walls who had just stopped 8,000 men without killing a single one. The second prince was the last to surrender. He dismounted from his horse. He drew his sword. He laid it on the ground. Ji-yeon approached him and said that he would be escorted to the governor's residence. He would be a guest, not a prisoner. He looked at her and asked who she was. She said she was Hwang Ji-yeon, head of security for Chorsan. He turned pale. He knew that name. Every warrior in the empire knew that name. She led him to the governor's house. Do-yoon was waiting inside. There was tea on the table, 2 cups. Do-yoon invited the prince to sit down. The prince sat down. Do-yoon poured him some tea and said that the war was over. The prince could stay here or return to the capital. If he returned, it would be with a message. The message was simple. Chorsan did not want war. Chorsan wanted to trade. But if anyone came again, the result would be the same. Only next time, Do-yun would not aim for the shields. The second prince drank his tea and remained silent. Then he asked what kind of power this was. Do-yun replied that it wasn't power, it was knowledge. The prince asked if it could be bought. Do-yun replied that it couldn't, but it could be learned. The prince looked at him. Then he finished his tea and said he would deliver the message. He left 2 days later. His army left with him, unarmed. The weapons remained in Chorsan, 6,000 swords, 2,000 spears, and 400 sets of armor. Foreman Kim looked at the mountains of captured iron and said the smelter would be busy for half a year. Do-yun said they would melt it all down. The swords would become railroad tracks, the armor would become boilers, the spears would become utility poles. The foreman asked what railroad tracks were. Do-yun smiled and said he'd find out soon enough. 2 years had passed. Do-yun stood on the tower in the center of Chorsan and looked down. The city below him was not the city he had arrived in 26 months ago. 6,000 residents, stone houses with tiled roofs, paved streets, electric lights in every window, a water supply system with copper pipes, a school for 200 students, a hospital where Somi, along with 4 assistants, treated 30 patients a day, soap, clean water, antiseptics made from mold extracts that Somi and Do-yun had obtained after 4 months of experimenting with bread mold. Rough, unpredictable, but they prevented blood poisoning, and that was enough. A smelter, a rolling mill, a wire drawing shop, a lathe workshop, a forge with a steam hammer. He looked at all this and thought that 2 years ago there had been nothing but ruins here and 400 starving people. After the punitive force was routed, the empire fell silent. The clans were silent. The court was silent. The third prince, Lee Kyung-ho, sent a letter congratulating them on their victory and requesting a personal meeting. The meeting took place in Yeonsan on neutral ground. Do-yun arrived with So-ari and Ji-yeon. The third prince arrived with Yoon Chung-soo and 10 guards. They spoke for 8 hours. Do-yun showed the prince the lantern. He showed him the blueprints. He showed him a map of Chorsan with the electrical grid. He did not show him the jammers. The third prince listened and asked questions. Intelligent questions. He asked if this energy could power carriages without horses. Do-yun said it could. The prince asked if it could transmit voice over a distance. Do-yun said it already did. The prince fell silent for a moment. Then he said that if Do-yun wanted it, he was ready to support his claim to the throne. Do-yun said he didn't want the throne. The prince didn't believe him. So, Ari intervened. She said that the fifth prince wanted not the throne, but a law. A law under which every person in the empire has the right to light, heat, and medical care without paying the magic tax. A law under which the clans lose their monopoly on artifacts. A law under which schools are opened in every county. The third prince listened. Then he said that such a law would destroy the clans, so Ari replied that it wouldn't. The clans would cease to be masters. They would become suppliers. The difference is that a supplier competes while a master takes as much as he wants. The clans would survive if they learned to compete. The third prince thought for a long time. Then he said he would support it, but in return he wanted to be the first to have electric light in his home in the capital. Do-yun agreed. A month after the meeting, news arrived. Emperor Li Ju-hwan had died. Quietly, in his sleep. The 4 eldest princes immediately began a war for the throne. The first and second princes united against the third and fourth. The capital was plunged into chaos. The clans chose sides. The priests shut themselves away in their temples. Ordinary people hid in their homes. Do-yun received this news via a telegraph line he had secretly strung along the trade route to Yeonsan over the past 6 months. 200 kilometers of copper wire on wooden poles disguised as pasture fences. So Ari stood beside him as the telegraph machine tapped out the message. She decoded it and read it aloud. Then she looked at Do-yun and said the time had come. He nodded. He knew that sooner or later this day would come, the day when he would have to leave Chorsan. He wasn't leaving with an army, he was leaving with a caravan. 50 wagons. On the wagons were generators, reels of wire, poles for power lines, light bulbs, hundreds of light bulbs. Glass bulbs with carbon filaments, each of which Grandma Park had wiped down with a cloth before packing because she said the light had to be pure. 200 people accompanied the caravan, not soldiers, engineers, workers from Chorsan who, over the course of 2 years, had learned to lay wires, erect poles, assemble generators and hook up homes. The first graduating class of his school. Among them were 40 former peasants and 60 young women, including Ha-in. Ha-in was riding next to Do-yoon. She held a thick notebook filled with calculations on her lap. She had calculated the electrical grid for the capital, 300 nodes, 500 kilometers of wire, 20 generators. She had worked on these calculations for 4 months. Do-yoon checked every number. He found 3 errors. She corrected them in an hour and found a 4th one that he had missed. The caravan traveled toward the capital for 12 days. Along the way, they stopped in villages. In each village, Do-yoon left 1 engineer and 1 generator. The engineer would assemble the generator, connect it to 10 houses, and turn on the lights. He would move on, leaving the villagers instructions that Ari had written in simple language with pictures, how to maintain the generator, how to change a light bulb, and how to repair a wire. 12 villages in 12 days, 12 points of light along the road from Chorsan to the capital. They entered the capital on the 13th day. The gates were open. The war between the princes had subsided. The 3rd prince, Lee Kyung-ho, was in control of the palace. The 1st and 4th princes had fled north. The 2nd prince, the very one whom Do-yoon had served tea to in Chorsan, was under house arrest, and, oddly enough, voluntarily. He himself had asked his 3rd brother to lock him up because he said he did not want to fight a man who had defeated him without killing him. The 3rd prince was waiting for Do-yoon on the palace steps. Yoon Chung-soo stood beside him. The 3rd prince said that the throne was empty, that the clans were waiting, that the people were waiting, that he needed someone who would bring light and whom the people would trust. He said he himself could not be that person because he was a politician, not a creator. The empire needed someone who creates, not someone who divides. Do-yoon stood in front of the palace and listened. Ari stood beside him. She was silent. She was waiting. Do-yoon turned to her. He asked quietly, "Ari, what do you think?" She replied that she thought the same thing she had on the first day, that it didn't matter to him what title he bore, that he would wear the crown like a helmet, that he would work in it just as he had worked without it, and that she would stay by his side, not because she was his wife by contract, but because she herself had decided so. Do-yoon looked at her. Then he said he'd like to ask her one thing. But he was an engineer and didn't know how to say such things beautifully, so Ari said she didn't need it to be beautiful. She needed it to be precise. He said he wanted her to be by his side, not as a wife by contract, but as the person he chose. She was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said she'd chosen him a long time ago. She'd just been waiting for him to weigh all the variables and come to the right answer. He laughed. For the first time in 2 years, he laughed loudly and freely. Ha-in stood behind him and rolled her eyes. Ji-yeon stood to his left, smoking a pipe with an expression of absolute calm. Somi stood on his right with her medical bag because she always stood with her medical bag. Grandma Park was crying in the front row. She wasn't crying out of grief. She was crying because the boy she had raised was standing in front of the palace, laughing and alive. The coronation was in the evening. Do-yoon climbed the steps of the throne room wearing a work jacket over his ceremonial hanbok. So, Ari carried the crown on a cushion. There was a small light bulb on the crown, a single glass vial containing a carbon filament. A wire ran inside the rim to a small battery hidden in the lining. Ha-in was holding the experiment log. She said she'd brought it just in case. Ji-yeon was walking unarmed for the first time in her life. Her copper bracelet hummed softly and grew warm because the jamming towers were active around the palace and she had nothing to fear. Somi walked with a bag. Grandmother Park sat in the front row, wiping her face with the sleeve of her hanbok. Foreman Kim Dae-soo stood by the wall in a clean shirt, not knowing what to do with his huge, scarred hands. Ha-in stood next to him, holding his elbow. The workers of Chorsan stood on the palace steps, engineers, the school's first graduating class, miners, carpenters, and blacksmiths who, in 2 years, had become electricians, mechanics, and operators. They stood in clean shirts and watched their governor as he made his way to the throne. Do-yoon took the crown. He placed it on his head. A light bulb flickered on. A warm orange glow filled the dimly lit throne room. He turned toward the hall, toward the aristocrats who were looking at him with horror and curiosity, toward the workers who were looking at him with pride, at his people, at Grandma Park, at Soari, who stood below and for the first time in 2 years wasn't hiding her smile, at Ha-in, who was already calculating in her head how much wiring it would take to light up the entire palace, at Ji-yeon, who stood without a sword or armor and looked calmer than ever, to Somi, who was checking the pulse of an elderly courtier in the front row because he'd become ill with nervousness, to Foreman Kim, who stood there crying silently, without holding back. Do-yoon looked at them all. Then he said what he'd been saying every day since his first day in Chorsan. He said 4 words. "There's light, let's keep working." And at that moment, at his signal, lamps flared up throughout the capital from the tower, all at once, in every house on the main street that his engineers had wired up over the past week. A warm orange light, not magical, not the cold blue flame of the clans. A living warm light from a glowing carbon filament inside a glass bulb. People poured into the streets and stared at the streetlights, not understanding what was happening. Children ran from streetlight to streetlight and counted them, just as they had once counted the revolutions of the water wheel in Chorsan. The elderly stood and wept because the light was warm and made faces look alive. For the first time in 1,000 years, the world of Haesin witnessed a dawn created by human hands. Grandmother Park stepped out onto the palace steps. She looked out at the glowing city. Then she looked up at Do-yoon, who was standing on the balcony with a small light bulb on his crown. She spoke so quietly that only Soari, standing next to her, could hear. She said that the boy had promised her she would never cry in the dark again. She said he had kept his word. Soari looked at her. Then she took the old woman's hand. They stood together on the palace steps and gazed at the lights. Lamps were lit in the streets of the capital. A water wheel turned in the Chorsan Mountains. People were working in the mine. Notebooks lay on the desks at school. At the hospital, Somi was washing her hands. In the workshop, the blueprint for the first steam locomotive lay on the workbench. The world was changing, not through magic, not through force, not through power, through copper wire and soap and the stubbornness of a single engineer who knew that light belongs to everyone.